Good morning, everyone. It is 9:15 and we're going to go ahead and get started. Lacey is going to play something that is going to be a good wake-up call for everyone this morning and a refresher as we begin this process. So if you're ready, we'll go ahead and start the Legislative Learning Lab.
Whew, you sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that sad little scrap of paper is.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee, but I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will, but today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, "You're right, there ought to be a law." Then he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill. And I'll remain a bill until they decide to make me a law. I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I got as far as Capitol Hill. Well, now I'm stuck in committee, and I'll sit here and wait while a few key congressmen discuss and debate whether they should let me be a law. I hope and pray that they will, but today I am still just a bill.
Listen to those congressmen arguing. Is all that discussion and debate about you?
Yeah, I'm one of the lucky ones. Most bills never even get this far. I hope they decide to report on me favorably, otherwise I may die.
Die?
Yeah, die in committee. Oh, but it looks like I'm gonna live. Now I go to the House of Representatives and they vote on me.
If they vote yes, what happens?
Then I go to the Senate and the whole thing starts all over again.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And if they vote for me on Capitol Hill, well, then I'm off to the White House where I'll wait in a line with a lot of other bills for the president to sign. And if he signs me, then I'll be a law. I hope and pray that he will. But today I am still just a bill.
You mean even if the whole Congress says you should be a law, the president can still say no?
Yes, that's called a veto. If the president vetoes me, I have to go back to Congress and they vote on me again, and by that time you're so
By that time, it's very unlikely that you become a law. It's not easy to become a law, is it?
No, but how I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
He signed your bill. Now you're a law.
Oh, yes.
Well, I hope everyone enjoyed that. I appreciated that comment. There's no way we could do a learning lab without discussing this cartoon that probably framed the idea in a lot of our minds to get involved in the process. I know it certainly impacted me. And Jill, I love that t-shirt you're wearing. You were prepared for today. I want to go ahead and get started with my portion of this. We want to start off with basically doing a deep dive into this video. And I am going to pull that up. So here we have the presentation I put together a few years ago. For those of you who don't know, I used to teach the legislative process to the PAGE program at the Capitol. And we put together this program years ago to be a primer for those pages going through. And just side note, if you have high school students who have not paged and they have an interest in government, you need to reach out to your lawmakers and get them to sign up. Even with the protocols this year, with COVID-19, they're still going to allow some pages to come to the Capitol and work. And it's certainly the main point that got me interested in serving in the legislature and being active in the process. So with Oklahoma, with our elections starting off every 2 years, we elect 24 state senators, which is half of the state Senate. And it's based on odd and even numbered districts of when they are up on the ballot. All 101 state representatives are up each 2 years. And then our 5 members of Congress. And we're waiting to see what happens with the census count this year in case we could possibly pick up one. It's doubtful, but every 10 years when we do the census, that's when redistricting and reapportionment happens. And we're keeping our fingers crossed that Oklahoma had a strong enough count to be able to gain 1 seat. Now, every 4 years, the voters elect 8 statewide officers. They have the governor, the lieutenant governor, the attorney general for the state, the treasurer, the superintendent of public instruction, the insurance commissioner, the state auditor and inspector, and the labor commissioner. As you can see in the subject line, those are midterm elections. That's the non-presidential years. Then every 6 years, we have the staggered terms for the corporation commissioners, and we have the staggered terms for our 2 U.S. senators. We just saw Senator Inhofe's election happen. He was reelected, and Senator Langford will be up next. And then we will have an off year where there will be no senators on the ballot. Now you see down here at the bottom, Oklahoma currently is one of 23 state governments under full Republican control, which means the legislative branch and the executive branch are controlled by the Republican Party. And we're one of 16 with a veto-proof Republican majority in the legislative branch. For the House of Representatives, as I said, there are 101 state representatives. They have their districts divided by redistricting after the census count, and we're about to see that happen. We're going to have a presentation on redistricting and what the process will happen with that. The members will go through the census numbers, and staff will draw up boundaries based upon an equal representation of population. And those 101 members will each have currently, I think it's about 38,000 in the House, and it will probably go up some because we're expecting the count to go over 4 million for the population for the state. The Republicans have controlled the House since 2004. The current breakdown is 82 Republicans and 19 Democrats, and the presiding officer, who was just reelected, is Speaker Charles McCall from Atoka. In the Senate, we have 48 state senators, and they're on the 4-year staggered terms, as we said before. Republicans have controlled the Senate since 2008. For 2 years prior to that, there was a tie, 24-24, and we had co-presiding officers, Glenn Coffey and Mike Morgan, Democrat and Republican, and they had a very good working agreement. And we'll see if the federal government has the same with the 50-50 tie up there. Current breakdown is 39 Republicans in the state Senate and 9 Democrats. They're presided over by President pro tempore Greg Treat from here in the metro area. And Lieutenant Governor Matt Pinnell is the president of the Senate, which mirrors the federal system, with the vice president being the president of the Senate. With legislation, you have to be careful when you're reading these bills, and you have to look through and make sure that you're looking at the right number and the right type of bill at the very beginning. For the bills, that's something you're going to see the most discussed at the Capitol. Probably 95% of the work that's done by legislators at the Capitol will be in a bill format. And if you see there at the top, Senate bills start with the number 1. So this session, since we're starting off a brand new legislature, the filing will begin with Senate Bill 1, whereas over in the House, it will be House Bill 1001. So you have to be sure and be careful. And up until just a few years ago, in fact, right before I got into the legislature, there weren't that many bills filed. You didn't have to worry about Senate Bill 1001 because the Senate never filed more than 1,000 bills. That has changed. We see the lawmakers more aggressive in their filings and putting forth more ideas that the staff has to type up. So you have to be sure and be careful to not confuse Senate Bill 1001 with House Bill 1001. Now, the bills, they have the force and effect of law, just like what we saw from the cartoon, and they must be passed by both chambers, the House and the Senate, and they must be signed by the governor, except if there's a provision in there that submits a question to the vote of the people. Anything that's submitted to the vote of the people through a vote on a ballot skips over the governor. And so sometimes a bill will include a provision like that. Generally, those are in what we'll discuss on the next type of legislation, the House Joint Resolutions, but occasionally something like that will be slipped into a bill. And they generally propose changes to the Oklahoma statutes, the laws that govern us here in the state of Oklahoma. Joint resolutions are similar to bills in that they also have the force and effect of law, and they must be passed by both chambers. These are the most common pieces of legislation that are used to submit a question to a vote of the people. The ones that don't get sent to a vote of the people, joint resolutions that do have some kind of statutory change in there, those must be signed by the governor. But anything, as I said before, that goes to a vote of the people will skip over the governor. And these will often not become a part of the statutes. They're used to do something temporarily to have the effect of law, but not be put into the statutes. Concurrent resolutions are expressing the opinion of both chambers, the House and the Senate. They don't have the effect of law. They must be passed by both chambers. They are not signed by the governor because they are just an opinion. And of course, they won't become a part of the statutes. So anytime both bodies agree on something, such as memorializing Congress to do something or recognizing an outstanding dignitary in Oklahoma, we will see both bodies of the legislature consider something like this. Simple resolutions don't have the force and effect of law. They must pass only one chamber, whichever chamber they're filed in. They're not signed by the governor, won't become a part of the statutes, and they just express the opinion of the one body. A lot of times at the beginning of session, you'll see concurrent resolutions filed, and towards the end of session, you will see simple resolutions filed when both the bodies are haggling, and for some reason they may not be getting along with each other. So both of those are just used to express support or try and encourage rejection of some topic, or they just want to spread goodwill. Now, measures being considered by the Oklahoma State Legislature pass through a variety of forms. The initial form, the original idea, just like what we saw from the cartoon, when the constituents wanted to see a stop put at a train track, the lawmaker will call up the staff members at the House and the Senate. Oh, let me turn that down. It's what happens when you pause the news and you forget to turn off the TV. So with the introduced version, the constituents will recommend that to the congressman or the state legislator in the case of what we're talking about. And that legislator will call up the staff members for their body. If they're a representative, they call the House staff. If they're a senator, they call the Senate staff. And they say, I want to do a bill that will address this topic. The staff members will get to work writing this, and these usually happen in late November, early December. The legislative staff work through the holidays there at the end of the year to type up all of these ideas for the lawmakers. And they may go through several drafts before they come up with the idea that the lawmaker likes. And then once that is finished, the introduced version is filed publicly for people to see. And those are introduced on the website for people to read before session begins. So that introduced version contains the initial idea that the lawmaker wants to see presented to the full body. So on the first day of session, they will convene and not only hear the governor's state of the state, but they will do the first reading of the bills. And on the first reading, those bills will be assigned a bill number officially. They already have a bill number from the introduction, but they read it, so it's considered as read. And then on the second day, those bills are submitted to a committee. The floor leader will go through and assign each bill to the committee where it will be heard, just like we saw again in the cartoon. And the committee will go through that. Now, after the measure has been heard by the committee and reported to the floor for further consideration, it's printed with changes made in the committee, and the highlights are usually in bold. So as that bill goes through the committee process, some changes could happen with that. And then we see the committee version. Now, once the committee version is brought forth, it goes to the full floor of the legislative body of where it's introduced. So House bills will be heard in the House, Senate bills will be heard in the Senate, and it's considered third reading on that. Now, in the Constitution, it says that Oklahoma has to have 3 readings on each bill in each legislative body. Therefore, the fastest you can pass a piece of legislation is 5 days, 5 working days. So first reading would happen on Monday, second reading would happen on Tuesday, third reading in the House of Origin will happen on Wednesday. You can also do the first reading in the opposite body on that Wednesday, second reading on Thursday, and then the third reading on Friday and send it to the governor, and the governor could sign it immediately. So the fastest you can pass a bill in the legislative process is 5 days. Some things have been changed a little bit in recent years with that, but that's what the Constitution spells out, and that's generally what the process is for almost every bill that goes through the system. Now, as the bills are considered in the House of Origin on that third reading, they will be brought up on the floor and discussed. Amendments could be offered at that point, and then they will take a vote after debate. And if the vote passes by a majority, and if there's an emergency clause in there with a 2/3 vote, then it's sent over to the other body. Once it leaves the House of Origin, it's considered the engrossed version of the bill. Now, it will go to the other side. They will go through the process just like it was on the initial first reading, second reading, third reading, go through the exact same system of a committee hearing, floor action, potential amendments. And if the bill passes out without any amendments from the opposite body, it's considered the enrolled version. It will go to the governor then, and the governor can take action. That rarely happens. The House and the Senate almost always have some kind of disagreement on some portion of a bill. And so when the House of Origin will not agree upon the amendments from the opposite body, the bill is sent to a conference committee. And the conference committee will go through and make suggestions. In recent years, the system changed in the House, where the conference committee is the original committee that heard the bill. The Senate, I believe, still will appoint a committee of members that will go through and make recommendations on a compromise. The conference committee is set up solely to try and find compromise language on a piece of legislation to get it passed by both bodies. The authors are still primarily in charge of this. The author in the House of Origin who originally suggested the idea usually takes charge of trying to get this bill through the system, and they will select an author from the opposite body. So on a House bill, the House author will have to go find a Senate author to shepherd that bill through the system on the Senate side. And the two of them will work together to try and get this through the conference committee. Now, once it passes the conference committee, once it again passes the body of origin and then the opposite body, then it's considered an enrolled version, and it will also go to the governor. So with the bills, you also have to pay attention to the sections in the bill and what the language is. So a bill could create new law, come up with a complete new idea on something you want to suggest. It can also amend existing law. It will go through and make changes to laws that have been passed prior and try and update and modernize that. It could repeal an existing law, something may be outdated and antiquated, and it needs to be removed because there's a conflict now. So you will have a repealer in there that will take out an old section of law that's no longer needed, or bills will be used to appropriate money or set budgetary limits. Most often bills will amend existing law. They go through and change some of the work done by a prior legislature. Those changes are easy to determine what is being amended because they're denoted with a strikeout on the language that's being taken out, or underlines for the language that will be new that's added into an existing statute. Most notable exception for new laws, repealers, and non-codified sections is they don't spell out any of the language. A repealer will simply say repealing section such and such. So that's where you have to go through. And as an advocate, you need to be wary of those. You need to be sure and look at what the repealer is taking out, because sometimes those are the easiest things to slip through. And that's where you may have the most damage done to a system. So it's vitally important to read the repealers, go find that section of the law because it's not written into the bill. Now, we're going to hear more about the budget timeline on Monday, but I wanted to have this in here just so you can kind of have an idea of where they're at in the process. January, first day of the legislative session, they will go through and do the formalities, pass the rules. The executive agencies are submitting their budgets. They're going through the budget hearings. If you've been watching the news, Justin Brown, the DHS director, presented the DHS budget yesterday. You have all of the agencies working with the lawmakers. Now, for those business-minded people, consider this. The governor is the chief executive officer of the state. The legislature is the board of directors. The board of directors control all of the actions that are important for the operation of the business or the state. And that's really the only way you can compare government to a business, is having those legislators be thought of as board of directors. And the board has a lot of power. For any of you that work in a nonprofit, you understand that the board are your bosses. And these are the ones that go through and give that direction on the important issues. You're there to do the day-to-day activities as the executive, but the board will make the big decisions. And that's what happens when you see the bylaws passed through your organization or the statutes passed by the legislators. Now, the first Monday in February, they will come in and do the state of the state in the House chamber through a joint session. And before they do that, each individual body will meet to do the first reading of the bills. So we will get to see the state of the state on Monday. After that, the legislature gets to work, and you'll see here February, March, April, and May. They're working on the laws, but the budget officers, the staff members, the members of the Appropriations Committee are working on forming the fiscal year budget for the state for the next year, and that will kick off July 1st. So as they're going through, they're going to make those changes through the legislative session. And then the agencies will go through and make sure that they have all the things lined out. June 30th, the fiscal year ends. July 1st, we have the beginning, and they will go through the process of distributing the funds from tax collections and other resources to the state agencies to make sure that those agencies have the money to operate. And then you'll get down to September, they start the process over. They submit the budget to OMS, Office of Management Enterprise Services, and then they will go through the review, and they just are on repeat. Now, the chief executive officer of the state is Governor Kevin Stitt, elected to a 4-year term with a 2-term limit. The powers and duties, he's the head of state and the chief executive for the state of Oklahoma. He's the commander-in-chief of the Oklahoma National Guard. He appoints, with confirmation by the state Senate, cabinet secretaries and various agency directors, and he delivers a state of the state address to the legislature on the first day of session. He was elected in 2018, and he has announced his re-election intent, which would be on the ballot in 2022. Now, the governor's main dealings with the legislature, other than using the bully pulpit on the first day of session to deliver a state of the state with his ideas of what he wants to see put into law, the governor will have his staff and his team working on his ideas, making sure that the answers are provided to the legislature for any questions they might have on the things that he has had submitted in bills. And the governor can't submit bills. He has to find a lawmaker to submit those for him. And so his ideas will be introduced. They will go through the system along with all the other ideas that are submitted by lawmakers, provided by constituents, or their own ideas. They go through the system that we just discussed. And once they pass, just like we saw in the cartoon, they go to the desk of the chief executive officer. Now in Oklahoma, we have a little bit different system than the federal government. The governor has the opportunity to approve the measure. He can sign it into law, and it becomes a law. He can veto the measure by returning it within 5 legislative days, with the Sundays accepted, Saturdays account, with his objections. He has to provide a statement of his objections. Now, it can just be as simple as, I don't like this. He doesn't have to spell out anything legally or for a reason. He can just say, I don't like this. Generally, governors will provide a detailed description of why they did not like the bill, because that's the only opportunity they have to really debate the system officially. And so those objections will be sent back to the legislature. Now, the legislature, if they're in session when he returns that veto, they have 5 days to take action on it. And the final week is critical in this process because all of the big bills that are considered by the legislature that the leadership wants are passed before the final 5 days, because the governor has a 5-day limitation to take action, and that forces his hand. And so any big bill is going to pass the next to last week before the session ends. So that gives them the opportunity to do an override if they need. Now, the governor has 2 other options, and it depends on the timing. If it's passed, as it says right here with the green, prior to the last 5 days of the session, the governor can hold on to it. And if the governor doesn't like a bill, in Oklahoma, he has the opportunity to do pocket passage. It can become law over the objections of the governor by just allowing it to sit on his desk. And after that 5 days, it's automatically signed without his permission. And so it would become law even if he doesn't take action. And so we've seen that happen very rarely, but it can happen. So the governor doesn't always have to sign something for it to become law. Now, if the legislature waits until the final 5 days to pass something and sends it to the governor has 15 days to take action on a bill. And so a lot of lawmakers, a lot of special interest groups that want a bill passed, they wait on pins and needles over those 15 days to see at the end of session if the governor is going to sign their bill or veto it, because after they're done, they can't go back in and just override the veto. They won't call themselves back in to override the veto. So by keeping those 15 days without taking official action, following the legislative session, the governor can sit on it, he can sign it, or he can veto it, or he can pocket veto it. By pocket veto, that means he just sits on it, and if he doesn't take action, it's automatically vetoed. Now, if it's in the first term of the legislature, so the first session would be the first year, which we're in right now. The second year would be the second session of the 58th legislature. They can go through and override a veto in that second session from the first year. Now, once the elections happen, all legislation that's still sitting on the desk is automatically wiped clean, and you have to start the process over. So every 2 years, you start the process over when it comes to the legislation. Here is a chart showing the Supreme Court and the other courts, the Court of Criminal Appeals, the Court of Civil Appeals. And this has been the best organizational chart I've seen describing the courts. Jerry Askins is going to be on with us later to talk about the executive branch and the legislative branches. She served in both of those. But I wanted to provide this chart just so you could see the breakdown of what we have with the courts. The 9 justices of the Oklahoma Supreme Court decide only civil cases, and the 5 judges of the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals will hear the criminal cases. The Oklahoma Supreme Court has immediate jurisdiction with respect to any new first impression issues, important legal issues, and the cases of great public interest. And in addition, they will hear all those cases coming up from the lower courts. And with respect to the Oklahoma Constitution, all judgments are final. The Supreme Court will hear any of the challenges that are submitted about a piece of legislation. And we saw one decided yesterday. There was, I believe, Treat versus Stitt on the tribal cases. And so anything that's dealing with actions by the state or anything dealing with a piece of legislation that's passed by the legislature, the court has the opportunity to have original jurisdiction on this and decide if it is constitutional. And in some cases, that will be pulled up if it violates something under federal law. It will go to the federal court. But when it comes to Oklahoma laws, the Supreme Court has the final say on something if it's constitutional or not under the Oklahoma Constitution. So that is the process on this spreadsheet. And I want to open it up and see if any of you have questions. I could not see any of the questions while I was presenting. And so now I want to open up for y'all to ask any questions you might have about the process. I know that this was a very intensive look at the process initially, but as the next few days go along, we're going to have the opportunity to discuss the entire legislative process, the nuances of the system, and what we might see come up as far as the different procedures. In this first legislative session this year, because of the census just finishing, the legislature has formed the committees that will look at redistricting. And we're going to hear from a staffer that has handled redistricting in the past about how that process goes through the system. We will also hear from a former budget director for the legislative staff talking about the appropriations process and what goes into that and who's really in charge of drawing up the budget. We intend to cover several of the different aspects of the process and hear from some experts about how different ideas get brought about and how is the most effective way to pursue an agenda as an advocate and with what can legally be done. One of the things I want to remind all of you that the IRS does watch lobbying activity, but you are allowed to expend just over 19% of your budget towards lobbying activity. And advocacy is something that's considered something that's fair game. Oklahoma Institute for Child Advocacy, 100% of our budget is spent on advocacy, whether it's the staff or the process of what we go through to try and encourage ideas. We have to monitor the lobbying activity to make sure that we're not going over that limit so we don't get in trouble with the Internal Revenue Service. Now, we do that very effectively, in my opinion. We provide that opportunity for children to have a voice at the Capitol, and as well as representing the different organizations that also have agendas that deal with children. And so we want to make sure that you are an effective advocate and you have the opportunity to use your voice. And Abigail just asked a great question. Yes, Oklahoma has a unique system with state questions. I've been involved with several state questions in the past, and it's a difficult process. And we do see some legislation that has been filed, and I won't express my opinions on those, but you can certainly shape your own. And I would encourage you to voice your opinions about this, whether you support this or are opposed to this. In Oklahoma, in our Constitution, it's written where we have the opportunity to petition our government. First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution allows you to petition your government. In Oklahoma, we have the system in place of what we have to follow as the state. So if you want to get something put on the ballot as a citizen and the legislature won't bring it up, you have several opportunities. You have the chance to put something in the state statutes, and you would have to do a petition that's drawn up formally and legally and filed with the Secretary of State and the Attorney General. And then you have, once it's approved, 90 days to go out and get signatures on that idea. You have to get 8% of the vote that was cast in the last governor's election for getting something on the ballot. It used to be the top spot on the ballot, but that was changed a few years ago to be set by the governor's election, because in presidential years, we have a higher turnout. So every 2 years, it was either easier, or the next 2 years, it was harder to get something on the ballot. And so lawmakers several years ago changed it where it's based solely upon the governor's turnout. So 8% of the vote that was cast for the governor in the last election where the governor was on the ballot, you have to get that amount of signatures on an officially filed petition and get that submitted to the Secretary of State within 90 days. For a constitutional change, you have to do 15% of the signatures from the last governor's election. And you'll have to forgive me, I don't off the top of my head remember what the number is for the signatures for challenging a law for what was passed by the legislature. We do have those two systems in place. You have the state questions that will be filed that will either put something new on, you can also take something out. But the citizens have 90 days to collect signatures to challenge a law that was passed by the legislature. And the last time that that was almost successfully tried, I'm gonna have a caveat on there, was House Bill 1017 back in the 1990s. And they didn't get the signatures in time to do the questioning of House Bill 1017. So once it became law, they did circulate a new petition and did get the signatures at that point to challenge all of the provisions under House Bill 1017. And citizens worked on that education reform and worked to get that upheld. And so you will see that happen sometimes. You may get enough signatures to challenge something, but the will of the people will support something, or they may deny something. And don't hold me to this, I think it's 5% of the last vote for the governor. Somebody can look that up and correct me on here if you want, but just from memory, I believe it's 5%. Now, does anyone else have any questions? That was a very good one. That's something I know we didn't have put in place to discuss throughout this conference. And that's something that advocates certainly have the chance to look at. There is legislation, as I said, that's filed to change the provisions. We will sometimes see something that wants to divide that percentage by congressional district or divide it by county. And that would hamper the will of the people as a whole by dividing it equally by the counties or by the congressional districts. How does the majority party control the bills heard in committees? That's another great question. So the majority party will elect the leadership of the legislature. Just federal level is the same, state is the same. We saw that happen with Vice President Kamala Harris being the president of the Senate. It's a 50-50 tie because the executive branch is controlled by the Democrats. Therefore, she becomes the presiding officer, breaks all ties. And so that allows the Democrats to control the appointments in the Senate at the federal level. Same thing happens here, but when the majority is controlled by one specific party in the legislative branch, they will get together in their caucuses. They will decide who they're going to select as the leader, and then they will go and take an official vote on the floor, allowing all members to vote on who the presiding officers will be. They will elect the president pro tem in the Senate, and in the House, they will elect the speaker and the speaker pro tem. Now, once those individuals are elected, they will appoint their top leaders on running the day-to-day activities. That will include the floor leaders who will control the flow of bills and decide which bills are heard on the floor. And they will also appoint all the committee chairs and vice chairs. The committee chairs will be the ones that go through and initially will narrow down the bills. You will see about 60% of the bills make it through the committee process. But when it gets all said and done, you're probably going to see about 10% of the bills actually make it through the entire process and go to the governor for signature or veto. So the majority party through the committee process will decide which bills are initially heard. And then once those bills are passed out of committee, then the floor leader controlled by the majority party will determine which bills are heard. Now, there will be a lot of haggling done. There will be some opportunities for the Democrats and Republicans to work together and trade off on ideas, say, we will support this idea if you support this idea. And so that compromise allows for some ideas that may not initially be supported by the majority party to still be heard. And there are also some provisions in the rules, and I don't know if CJ covered this, but there are opportunities in the rules for a minority of members, not necessarily the minority party, but a minority of the members to be able to circulate a petition to have something heard over the objections of the committee chair or be brought to the floor. And so an author can go around and try and get a petition signed by the membership. And if enough of them sign it, then it can go over the objections of that person in charge and try and get something heard. And why does the House allow expert testimony in committee when a bill is being considered where the Senate does not? That is simply up to the committee chairs to allow someone to speak in their committees when they choose. Each body is in charge of establishing their own rules. There will be joint rules that govern the activities when both bodies work together, but each body is in charge of establishing its own rules. And oftentimes those rules allow the committee chairs to determine the rules of process in each committee. So each committee could have different rules in place about the wishes and objections of the chair. The most powerful person in the legislative branch is a committee chair because they control their own committee and they have the full say on if something is going to be heard or not, unless a majority of the membership of that committee want to do something over the objections of the chair, which rarely happens. And so it's really up to the will of that committee chair or the will of the majority body. And Miranda said it is 5% from what I said earlier on the signatures for doing something over the legislature. If the legislature passes something then 5% of the people can pass a petition from those votes. And you don't have to have voted to sign the petition. You just have to be a registered voter. So if you didn't vote in the last governor's race, but you're a registered voter, you can still sign that petition. So keep that in mind if there's something out there that you want to try and get passed, or if the legislature passes something that you don't like, that 5% petition can send that to a vote of the people to question that. These are some fantastic questions and things that we did not include in the process. And we've got about 5 more minutes before we kick off to the next thing. So if anyone has any further questions, please shoot them to us here in the chat section. I will say I had the great pleasure of serving out in the legislature for 12 years. I was a staffer for 7 years, and I have loved the opportunity to be active in the process. I especially love this opportunity now working with OICA to be active in policy work to bring forth statistics and data for the lawmakers and the agency directors to show them the facts behind what we need to see improve for child advocacy. I know each of you has that job also provide that information. We want you to speak up and use your voice because you are the expert in your field when it comes to the work that you do. And lawmakers need to hear those opinions. We have a lot of lawmakers out there that are very skilled in their career path, but we can't expect them to be experts in everything. I relied on my constituents and people I trusted who I consider to be experts in different fields, provide that information to me so I could cast an informed and educated vote on issues. And if you don't speak up, then they won't know you're there to offer those suggestions. So extend that olive branch, reach out to those lawmakers, and be that resource expert for them. And so next question, so the Senate could change their stance on expert testimony at any time. Absolutely. Lawmakers can make a change in policy. If you go and talk to the presiding officer, you can ask them to please change that. If they hear from enough people, they're going to consider that. Lawmakers serve at the will of the people, and they want to continue in their jobs for as long as they're allowed under the 12-year term limit. And so if enough people want to have some policy changed, if enough voices speak out, then that could be an influence that would drive that decision. So make sure that you voice your concerns to your own lawmaker. If you don't know who your own senator and representative are, you need to be sure and look that up. And you can go to the election board website, fill in your information, and they can tell you that as far as who your own senator and representative are, and reach out to them. So we have one, how many committees are in each house and how many are in a committee? And how are the committees compromised? Or are they chosen by the chairman? Great question. The committee numbers and names are established by the presiding officer, the speaker, the president pro tem. I believe the House has a record number of committees this year. And so they had to provide leadership positions for the members of their caucus. And oftentimes you will have members of the minority party put in as vice chairs in some instances. And so the presiding officer will determine what committees there are and how many committees are set up. And generally, the majority party, the presiding officer with his leadership team, will assign the members of the majority party to a committee, and it's by a committee preference. So members will get to say, I want to serve on these 5 committees, and the presiding officer may put them on 3 committees, and sometimes you don't even get the committees you are having a preference. It depends on majority party and minority party terms. So senior members will have a little bit more influence on what committees they get to sit on than maybe a freshman. And so that's all determined by the presiding officers and their teams and the minority party leadership and their teams of who gets to serve on the committees. The speaker will establish the number of members on a committee in the House. The president pro tem will assign the number of members on a committee in the Senate. And sometimes there's no rhyme or reason to the committees you get on. It just is up to the will of those leadership teams in your own party. Sometimes the presiding officer in the majority party will say the minority party doesn't get to select, and they will just assign everything. So it really just depends on the mood and the temperament of the legislature starting off. And yes, we will be providing links for this. So Lacey just put that in there. We want to make sure that everybody who missed this has the opportunity to have the chance to learn more about it and follow up later on. And we'll ask last question from Carrie before we move on to the next. To continue, if your lawmaker isn't on the legislative committee you want to influence, what is the best way to make an impression on these legislators? You as an advocate need to know your own senator and representative. And then if you're working in an area of interest like children, youth, and family services, you need to get to know that committee chair and vice chair and the membership of the committee, and let them know you're approaching them from a professional perspective, not as a constituent, but as someone who works in that area. I picked on that committee because Carol Bush in the House is the chair, and she is phenomenal to work with. She is great to visit with, discuss ideas, and she is one of the committee chairs that allows all bills submitted to her committee to be heard. She doesn't reject a single bill that goes through her committee. That's a rarity. Committee chairs, as I said, have complete control over the legislation. She has allowed all bills in the past to be heard that are filed with her committee by the floor leader. And so if that's the area, you need to get to know those members of the committee and the leadership of that committee to make sure that they know the good points and the bad points about a piece of legislation. And in the House, as I said, you can have the opportunity to testify on these. When we're in a pandemic, it all depends on how the system is going to be set up to allow the public to influence that. But certainly reach out to the committee chairs to find out if there is an opportunity to present a public statement about a piece of legislation. And I agree, Mark McBride on the House, he tries to hear all the bills also. We have some great lawmakers up there who allow all the ideas to be heard. Some pick and choose. It's just up to that person. So with that, we are at 10 o'clock, a couple of minutes over, and I'm going to turn it over to Lacey. As I can't see my agenda, you would say who is coming up next. I believe we have it set up where, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, we have two former lawmakers that will be speaking about how to be an influence in the process.
We're going to do that, but before we do, we're going to share a video from our sponsor with the Journal Record.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Sarah Barrow. I'm the advertising director for the Journal Record. We are helping sponsor today's Legislative Learning Lab. So I just wanted to say a few words about some of the things that may be important to you. This year, we do have a Capitol reporter, Janice Francis Smith, who will be covering what's going on at the Capitol every day during legislative session. And we also will be hosting our own legislative forum next week on February 4th. So please go to our website, journalrecord.com, and sign up for the forum, and also sign up to either get your daily update, our business intelligence report, or to subscribe to the paper if you aren't a current subscriber. I hope you enjoyed today's Learning Lab, and we appreciate the opportunity to sponsor it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lacey. I'm glad you are here to run the show. We have some great sponsors, and we'll show you a slide of those. Journal Record provided sponsorship ads for us in the paper, and we've had some other great sponsors that we'll list here in a few minutes. As we move into this next process, we have two former lawmakers that are phenomenal advocates in their own right, following their legislative career, and still work very hard. And I'm buttering one of them up as she's on our board of directors, and the other one was my representative, which I take special privilege in being able to call somebody else my representative, having served out there. And I thought he did a fantastic job. It's my pleasure to welcome AJ Griffin and Jason Dunnington.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Joe. Good morning, everyone. So, Jason, you want to start? I know I'm from the upper chamber, and I should get to go first, but I'll defer.
Here we go with the Senate House stuff already.
Hey, you know.
Yeah, I'll just, really excited to be here with everyone this morning, and, this opportunity to talk to you guys about how to advocate for children here in the state of Oklahoma. I think it's really important right now, and I'm not telling you all anything that you don't know, but Oklahoma still has, record amount of food insecurities for children right now. We deal with the ACEs issue on a daily basis that kids are struggling with. COVID has really shaken things up in the state of Oklahoma, just with how many of our kids have been in bad or negative in-home situations because they've been at home more often. Certainly there is a lot of work for us to continue to do in order for us to focus on making sure that our kids here in the state of Oklahoma have opportunity, to turn into the incredible adults that all of us want to see them do. And so the work that you all do is so important, not just now, like during a pandemic, but just in general, as we continue to try and put issues that face our children at the forefront. It's, as Joe would tell you, OHCA is never going to be an organization that throws around money like oil and gas, or like big utilities or any of the other, groups at the Capitol that can kind of buy their way into rooms. We do that on, the hard work of volunteers and agencies and organizations that focus on kids' issues every day. And so we have to work even harder to put those in front of members in both the House and the Senate. I can tell you from experience in the House, there's a lot of us over there. There were 101, so twice as many as what's in the Senate. And so when you start looking at advocating for kids, when you're looking at focusing on the House side, there's more people to talk to over there. And that can be a good thing and a bad thing. But as Joe's already alluded to, there's some really incredible, thoughtful House members. I know Representative Bush is certainly one of those. Representative Lawson, who I think is going to talk to you all a little bit later today, has really established himself as someone that is a go-to in child advocacy issues. But I encourage you, and we can talk here in a second. I'll let AJ kind of give her little intro, and we can answer questions for you all. But certainly happy to chat with you on best ways to advocate for children, at least from our experience. And then any other questions that you may all have. So I'll turn it over to my senior member.
I knew.
AJ Griffin.
I knew you'd get a dig in on me as well. So as you can tell, there is a friendly rivalry between the two chambers, and it's by design that the House and the Senate are very different. Joe, you talked about that a little bit in the last segment, but we saw that manifest itself at the federal level recently when on a particular vote, our senators and our House members voted differently. At this federal level, senators run every 6 years. The state level, it's every 4. And that's by design. It's to allow the Senate to have a little more detachment from the people. There's still an issue of representation, but the House is supposed to be really close to the people. They're supposed to make votes based on whatever the people are telling them at that time. So that difference is intentional, and it's by design for there be a different procedure. Someone asked in the last session also about why the Senate doesn't allow expert testimony and the House does. Well, some of that's by design as well. The senators are supposed to be a little more detached, and just so that we should have a little different perspective on the same issue. So if you have questions about that, I know, Jason, I'd be happy to talk about that. But from an advocacy perspective, one of my favorite things now as a former, I haven't gotten my vanity plate that says former, but I think so, because it's so important that once you understand the process, that knowledge becomes your tool. And really what Joe just did for you all is the most important thing. You have to understand the process, because when you understand it, it's no longer scary or intimidating. And for most advocates, just making the leap to actually reach out to an elected lawmaker is the hardest part. And I've got friends on this call. Hi, Chris. Hi, Judge Francine. They are not intimidated by this process at all, but because they've done it before and they realize that, trust me, if I can get elected, and if Jason can get elected, and for crying out loud, if Joe could get elected, so can any of you. We've seen that. You don't be intimidated by the people that hold the positions, because they answer to you. And then once you understand the process and you observe it a little bit, that becomes your tool, so that you can build the relationships to be an effective advocate. I love influencing policy on this side. Joe mentioned I serve on his boards, but I now get to serve on some national boards. I serve on a national board for an organization called Human Rights for Kids, and we're working to end juvenile life without parole sentences across the United States. Important work. I serve on an advocacy, an advisory committee for a prenatal 3 policy investigative research project out of the University of Texas. And so once you understand how this process works and the power of policy in all our lives, then you have this tool necessary to really be an effective change advocate. If your organization, if you work for a nonprofit in particular, if you do not have a policy objective, you're missing a huge area of influence. And yes, nonprofits can work in the policy arena. Joe, help us make sure they understand that. I serve on the Center for Nonprofits board as well, and we're really working to try to teach advocates how to effectively do this. You can't write checks to candidates, but there's a lot of things you can do that are much more important. So,
yeah, I'll follow up on that, AJ. A couple of things that I think that are really important that you brought up. One is in the advocacy piece. Know what you're asking for when you're talking to members. I can't tell you how many times that I had really, really well-meaning groups come in on advocacy day or just on their own time up to the Capitol, schedule an appointment, met with us. And, we were in a meeting for the better part of half an hour. And I knew what their organization was, but I still had no idea what they were asking for. And so, know what you're asking for and don't be afraid to step in and immediately get to the point. Especially during session, House and Senate members are extremely busy, bouncing between their responsibilities in their own home districts, responsibilities to their own homes, their own families, responsibilities to all of the different committees that they sit on, all the different bills that are in those committees, all of the different groups that are also talking to them, not to mention their duties to the House and floor votes that they have. So it's an extremely busy time, and I can promise you it is not rude at all to go into an office and within a few minutes after the introduction say, this is what we want. We would like for you to vote yes on House Bill such and such, or we would like for you to vote no on Senate Bill such and such, and these are our reasons why, and then move on and go talk to the next one. You don't need to spend an hour with them, moving around and trying to figure out how to best say that you want them to vote. Just tell them what is that you want and advocate for your organization. I promise you'll find that well received. And then the other thing that just kind of jarred my thinking process when AJ was talking was, right now is that time where you're seeing like that there were 3,100 something bills that were filed, and you're probably thinking, oh my gosh, like how is it possible that we have this much to do? Well, we don't. Only about 300 of those bills will ever be signed into law. The vast majority of them are either A, not going to get heard, or B, they're going to go away. And that's for good reason on a lot of it, because some of them are just terrible legislation. They're, using it to make a point, do something, whatever the case may be. But this is the time of year where everyone like panics and freaks out about a lot of bills that will just never go anywhere. So as an organization, I would say, focus on the things that matter the most to your organization and hone in on the areas that that you can be effective in getting something done. And let the other stuff just be the noise that it is. Because when people spend too much of their bandwidth worrying about the crazy stuff, and there's plenty of it this year, then you lose the opportunity to focus on the stuff that that you can accomplish as an organization.
And we had a couple of questions. I want to help address one. Emily asked, can you address the distinction between advocacy and lobbying? The first thing I'm going to do is recommend the Center for Nonprofits has some groups that are working right now, and those two organizations collaborate, OICA and OCNPC. If you have specific questions, Dan Billingsley is a wonderful resource at the Center for Nonprofits, but I'll go into that a little bit. Really, the rules that governing lobbying have as much to do with money as anything else. 501c3 organizations are allowed a percentage of their expenditures on advocacy or / lobbying. You can hire a lobbyist for your organization, but it can only represent, I can't remember the exact amount of money, but I think it's 15% of your income can be spent on that particular activity. So you wanted to check that. What is it?
Up to 20%.
Up to 20%. Okay, I was being too conservative there. Shocker.
It doesn't hurt to be, though.
Yeah, on that activity. Then actually your actions, if you are representing a cause and that a particular piece of legislation is part of that cause, that's advocacy. If you're educating, even if you say, I want you to vote no and here are the reasons why. Now, if your lobbyist that you pay to do that, there's rules governing those behaviors, but you as an advocate, really the restrictions are around campaigns. This is where you can get yourself in trouble. You can, as Chris Hopper, donate personal money, attend fundraisers for candidates. You as Chris Hopper, Hearts for Hearing, cannot. So you wouldn't put a sign in front of your nonprofit advocating for a candidate. You wouldn't attend a fundraiser wearing your name tag, then showing that you're representing your organization, but you can go as your individual person. So if you ever have questions, just reach out to Dan and or Joe. Joe can help you with this. I'd be happy to as well. But you really can do more than what you think you can. Then the next question was on how the chambers will handle the pandemic and Zoom. That really has yet to be determined. I think, Jason, tell me what you think. I think they'll probably start with business as normal, and depending on what happens, then they'll respond. Legislative bodies are responsive. They're not generally proactive.
Yeah.
If you ever expect them to get out in front of something, that's not how this works.
Well, and we've seen, the Missouri legislature started up a few weeks ago, and a week in, they had a COVID outbreak and then decided to do things more remotely. So I really think that a lot of it is just going to be, like kind of point in time. I think they're all going back next week, and I think the intent is to have business as usual. But, I think that could change if, certain variables change in the next couple of weeks. One of the things that I would tell you, I know for a fact that my office was run by my legislative assistant. And so Megan Hansen made me look way better than I ever was as a member, because she was such an incredible legislative assistant. And that's really your gatekeepers in. So like I see, willing to do Zoom calls face-to-face. A great secret is to go through the assistants and to have them set you appointments. And you can do that with Zoom this year. You can call legislative assistant, our organization would really like 10 minutes of such and such's time. We can send you a Zoom link for that. Would you please put this on their schedule? And that's a great way to get on their schedule, especially in a pandemic year when you may not feel comfortable going into the building. I can't say for certain, but I think that it's probably a pretty safe assumption to say that at least a third of the legislature has already had COVID. And whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, I think it is putting them in a more cavalier position of, well, I've already had it, so I don't need to worry about it. And, my few instances in being back up there in the last week or so has been that there isn't a lot of mask wearing in the Capitol, but that doesn't mean that if you go up there, you can't wear yours. I mean, you need to be you and feel comfortable and feel safe doing what you think is best for you and your organization.
Joe has a question that he put in that he wants us to ask, and it's the best way to approach lawmakers, rural versus urban. I served a rural district. Jason was an urban. And really, that personal relationship is the most important thing, especially in rural areas. But if not, I think that the best way to do it is to kind of frame it like you're a salesperson. And yes, this person works for you. If they're an elected official, they work for the people of the state of Oklahoma. But if you were trying to sell someone an idea or a product, you would probably be respectful of their time. You would set an appointment. You would show up on time. You would conduct yourself in a manner that was professional and appropriate to the situation. I'm going to tell you the least effective way, in my experience, is to show up in a mob wearing matching t-shirts and yell at people. So when things get to that, we've gone way too far. So a personal relationship is the most effective. Secondly, a professional relationship, and then use all of the methods to communicate: email, telephone, social media. But if you're going to be more effective if you conduct yourself in a professional way and represent your issue appropriately.
Yeah, there's also the dirty little secret that elected officials like to get credit for things. And so if your organization has something that's going on in their district, and you're able to reach out ahead of time and invite them to come and be a part, and they get to, take credit for some great thing happening in their district, they love that. And it's a great point of contact to get them interested in and involved in issues that you care about as well. And so if your organizations are operating, like a food pantry or something that's going on more in a more rural area, then figure out a way to invite them to come to the location that's in the district. I think a lot of people focus on advocacy in Oklahoma City at the Capitol, but what I have found is that some of the best advocacy happens outside of session, between June and January, in the districts of those that are elected. And when you take the time to meet them in district and do things and show them what you're doing, I think that only bolsters your advocacy during session, because they've got that touch point.
And Jason, I want to touch on that. AJ represented a rural district. I represented a very rural district, and Mondays would be spent at the Sterling Coffee Shop. Tuesdays would be spent at the Surreal Coffee Shop. Fridays were spent at the Elgin Coffee Shop. And that was just catching the guys that could solve all the world's problems and create a few new ones. And a rural legislator will go around the district to several different regular spots or set up town halls. And the funny thing was, I would catch more people at just a coffee shop gathering with the normal crowd than I would at setting up an established town hall, because people are either too busy or don't want to spend their free time talking about politics, even though they do it, the guys do, in the morning. And so get to know the nuances of your own lawmaker, figure out their schedule, and absolutely, when session is out, meet with them in their district if you're a constituent, or if you really are gung-ho, offer to go to their district and sit down with them at a public place. And they love doing that because they like to be seen out in public, because it helps them with their reelection.
I'd like it to be known that we have urban chickens in the Plaza district. So you guys in your rural districts, like we still have,
We did have one question up here too about, Carrie had asked about people reaching out to lawmakers. Could a few people actually influence a decision by lawmakers? And I already answered, but I'd like to hear your opinions on the number of bills compared to the amount of contact we hear from constituents.
We would have very large pieces of legislation that's extremely impactful, and I wouldn't hear from anyone. Or the only people that I would hear from were people who would make money or lose money on that particular piece of legislation. And truthfully, the value of my constituency was pretty important. Joe, I always tell groups, anytime I talk about advocacy, your goal as an advocate is to have your phone number in your elected official's cell phone, so that when you call them, your name comes up and they know who you are. not to have, for you to have their number. I don't know, there were thousands of people that had my cell phone number. That wasn't that big a deal. But when I had someone's number and I got that phone call or I got that text, and I knew who that person was and I knew what they wanted before I even read it, that's when you have become an effective advocate. So if you're one of those 5 people on that issue, that's where you're really impactful.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, of the thousands of bills that are filed every year, I would guess that on an average session, I would hear from either constituents or advocacy groups or lobbyists on maybe 200 of them. And the vast majority of them, nothing, just crickets on it. And so, in that regard, yes, I do think that even a small number of people can have an effect. And sometimes, members are just looking for, and I hate to put it so bluntly, but they're looking for an excuse to be able to vote no on something or yes on something. And if that excuse is, well, I have a constituent that really doesn't like this, that's enough for them. And so, doing the hard work and getting in and understanding what those bills are early and having that touch point on, either for or against can make a big difference. When so few bills end up with, much talk, either for or against.
I have a kind of a loaded question for both of you. Do you have to be a registered voter to make a difference in policy? And I know that can be taken different ways, and I want you to address it both ways. But the second part is, I'm talking also about young people before they turn 18. So talk about the difference between adults being registered voters having an impact and young people having an impact.
Well, we're probably not the right people to ask this, because Jason and I both, I will brag on him. He really cared what people thought, and he cared about his constituents. And so I also know he's very kind and generous, and he listens to everybody that approached them regardless. But yeah, kids can really be impactful, especially their stories. And things that are personal. We get provided a lot of data, a lot of quantitative things. Give us some of that qualitative stuff. The story behind the issue is extremely important. And the messenger of that story, whether you're a voter or not, to me was always really irrelevant.
Well, thank you for those kind words. I'll brag on the senator. I was only as effective as I could be as a member of the minority party because of the opportunity to work with senators like AJ, who carried some of my bills and would help me get things passed in the Senate. And there are some really incredibly good, thoughtful people in the legislature. Sure, they're the ones that we all know about that make the news, regularly because of some of the insane things that they run. But I still think that's a minority of members in our Oklahoma State legislature. So, I absolutely think kids can make a difference. And I think that when you empower kids to make a difference early, you're building for a future. And so you're being proactive in the kind of policy that you want to see 10 years from now, 20 years from now. When you try to tell kids that their opinion doesn't matter and that they need to be an adult in order to have a say on something, you're just holding back, potential policy for them, in the long term. So I obviously advocate for my own kids. I've taken my kids to vote with me ever since they were babies. I still never forget when we were standing in line in 2012, and my son would have been 6 at the time. My daughter was 3. So I was holding my son's hand, waiting in line to vote in the presidential election. And Luca looked back at me and said, "Dad, is everyone voting for Obama?" And the guy behind us was like, "Oh, hell no." And so, but everyone in line kind of started booing, like, "Oh, just let the kid be, fine." But my kids will know when they turn 18 that it's time to vote because they've been going with me, and they'll know to be advocates. And that's what we want from all of our children. And the more that we can empower them to do that, the better off our society is going to be.
I'll take it one step further. Any lawmaker that won't listen to a child, vote them out, because their motivation is probably not what it should be.
I couldn't agree with you both more. One of my first memories is my parents taking me with them when they voted out, and we lived out in California then. And I remember my dad was going to vote against someone rather than votes for someone. And you have a lot of different reasons for why you vote. And I wanted you to convey that about how important it is for everyone to speak up. Now, I will say, when I was in the legislature, and you two may have been much nicer, but when people from the district contacted me, I did look up to see if they were active, and I would chastise them if they didn't vote. And tell them, and they were probably going to vote against me, but I still wanted them to be active and registered to vote. And it's important as an advocate to also understand if you are a constituent, because it's very different. A constituent lives in the area that can cast a vote for that person. So I often would hear from my constituents out of state in emails. Sorry, but that's not a constituent. So be sure you use the right language when contacting lawmakers.
Indeed. Well, I don't know how much time we have left, Joe. I think we were slated until 10:30. So if that's the case, I just want to take one last second to tell everyone thank you for being a part of this very important call. Thank you for being an advocate for children in the state of Oklahoma, and for, I'm sure, all of the volunteer hours that you put in to give our kids the best chance at a better future. I certainly appreciate that as a father and as an Oklahoman.
Senator?
Muted myself. I'll just echo what my friend Jason said, and thanks for being involved. And don't be intimidated by the process. It belongs to you.
We can't thank you both enough. Jason is former, I don't know, are you still teaching college? Are you an adjunct professor?
I'm still adjunct professor at Oklahoma City University, yeah.
And AJ's former director of youth services. Both of these lawmakers have been outstanding advocates for young people, and they continue that following their term in the legislature, and can't thank them enough. And looking forward to working with you for many years ahead in dealing with child advocacy.
As are we. Thanks, everyone.
And next, as I said, we had one presenter who was not able to make it this week because of work commitments. CJ Caven is the parliamentarian for the House of Representatives. He did present his portion of this as a video, and so Lacey is going to key that up, and we will watch his video. I'm a registered parliamentarian, so I'll be able to answer hopefully some of the technical questions you might have, but we want you to hear from the parliamentarian for the presiding officers on this segment.
Hello, my name is CJ Caven, and I'm honored to serve as the parliamentarian for the Oklahoma House of Representatives. Joe Dorman and the team at OICA asked me to speak and talk about the importance of parliamentary procedure in the legislative process. But as you know, the legislative session starts next week, and I'm absolutely swamped with getting ready for session next week, with trainings and getting the chamber ready and getting everything done that we need to do to have a successful legislative session. So I offered to record a video instead and talk about the legislative procedure and the legislative process and how parliamentary procedure relates to that. So today I want to talk about why is it important to learn parliamentary procedure? Where do you look for procedural information? What are the basic principles of parliamentary procedure? And I want to briefly talk about the typical stages for law enactment. So Mason's Manual of Legislative Procedure says that every legislative body must have rules to promote the orderly and businesslike consideration of questions that come before it for determination. These rules determine the priority and manner of consideration of questions and provide an orderly and methodical plan so that all business may receive proper consideration. So why is it important to learn parliamentary procedure? Well, the state legislature has expansive reach of legislative power. The legislature determines the operation and structure of government. It allocates resources for governmental operation, and it makes public and private laws. How well a legislature executes these powers depends on the processes and procedures it follows. And it allows the creation of public policy in an open, transparent, and efficient manner. And I think we can all agree that an open and transparent government is vital. Additionally, it provides the tools and framework for effective group action. The legislature is not one or two people making decisions in a vacuum. It is a collection. In Oklahoma, it's 149 legislators making decisions on behalf of nearly 4 million Oklahomans. Parliamentary procedure ensures and balances the rights of various groups within the legislature, specifically the 149 individual members, the minority, the majority, the whole body, and those that are affected by the body's decisions, like the public. So where do you look for procedural information? Well, procedural information in Oklahoma comes from a variety of different sources. First and foremost is the state constitution. There are several procedural safeguards embedded within the state constitution that the legislature must follow. Also, what does the courts say about the state constitution? How does the Supreme Court or other courts interpret those procedural safeguards built into the Constitution? Those are important to follow as well. Each chamber adopts its own rules, and they also adopt joint rules that governs actions in between the chambers as well. Within each chamber, they also have custom and precedent. In the Oklahoma House of Representatives, we actually publish a procedural manual that includes both the House rules, the joint rules, and the precedent, or all of the previous rulings that have come down in the House of Representatives. We publish this all into one book, and it's available to all of the members, but it's also available on the House website as well. Statutes are also important. They can't conflict with the chamber rules, but there's numerous statutes that have interplay with the legislative process. The adopted parliamentary manual. The Oklahoma Legislature, both the House and the Senate, use Mason's Manual of Legislative Procedure. This book is updated about once every 10 years. In fact, the newest edition came out in October of 2020. So a new edition came out, and we're still working through that and determining the differences between the 2010 version and the 2020 version and the impact it has, if any, on our process. And last, but certainly one of the most important places that we look for procedural information is general parliamentary law. So the state constitution serves as the basic laws for the entire state. It creates what the people of the state view as the key components for governance. Constitutional requirements must be followed. For example, in the legislative context, 3 readings of a bill on 3 different days. This is an absolute must. So what that means is, and we'll talk about this as well a little bit later, but what that means is a bill must go through each chamber on 3 different days: first reading, second reading, and third reading. Both chambers must pass identical versions of a measure. The House has to pass the same version, the Senate has to pass the same version, and if they pass differences, how do you reconcile those? And the Constitution also requires that bills must have a complete title and enacting clause. Judicial decisions. Obviously, the courts make final decisions on all constitutional questions, and these decisions certainly impact the legislature's procedure and how we go about conducting the business of the people of the state of Oklahoma. Chamber rules. Article 5, Section 30 says that each house may determine the rules of its proceedings. This is the constitutional bedrock for House and Senate rules and for joint rules and how we govern and how we conduct the business of both chambers on a day-to-day basis. There's chamber customs and precedents. We've talked a little bit about these. The custom and precedents of each chamber are developed over time. Many are written, many are unwritten, but it's the basis of procedure that's kind of built up over the years. These custom and precedents are established practice that have been tested by experience, they've been found useful, and they've been generally accepted. So statutes that don't conflict with chamber rules, statutes that don't conflict with the rules adopted by the legislature can affect the procedure as well. As mentioned, the adopted parliamentary manual, legislative chambers often choose a parliamentary manual for guidance and to cover issues not addressed by their own rules. Mason's Manual of Legislative Procedure serves as the parliamentary authority for most state legislatures, not all. Some use Robert's Rules of Order, some use other parliamentary authorities, and some just use their adopted rules. But Mason's Manual serves as a great basis for any state legislature when they're needing gaps filled in. In general parliamentary law, it's a system of principles common to the procedural practices of many organizations. General parliamentary law has evolved through centuries of procedural trial and error, and it's not fixed, it's not set, it's not final. It's a continual process and is constantly changing and continues to change as new uses gain general acceptance. So what are the basic principles of parliamentary procedure? And I would contend that there's 10, and I want to quickly go over those. 1, the group must have the authority to take the actions it purports to take. So in our context, the legislature has to have the authority to do the things that it's going to do. Well, where does it get that authority? It gets it from the people, It gets it through elections. It gets it from the state constitution. Some of it gets from the federal government, things that it's delegated either explicitly or implicitly in the Constitution. So the group must have authority to take the actions that it takes. A meeting of decision-making group must take place. The Assembly, the Legislature, the House, the Senate have to get together and meet and discuss and deliberate over legislation, resolutions, motions, things that it does. A proper notice of the meeting must be given to all members of the group. A quorum must be present at the meeting, meaning a quorum means a minimum number of people to conduct business. A decision must be before the group upon which it can decide. A group can't get together and just talk about whatever it wants to talk about. It has to have a question. It has to have a motion or a bill or a resolution. An opportunity to debate the question must be allowed. The question must be decided by casting a vote. A majority vote to take an action or decide a question must occur. There can't be any fraud, trickery, or deception resulting in injury to any member. And to be valid, any action or decision of a body must not violate any applicable law or constitutional provision. So I want to talk about a couple of different things, a couple of different terms that we often hear in the legislative process. And I've kind of organized these alphabetically. They're not in order of importance, but I think it's helpful to talk about a couple of the different things that you'll hear on a daily basis around the legislative process. The first is, what is a bill? Well, a bill is the formal draft of a proposed law presented to the legislature for consideration. So you're viewing this the week before session. Last week was the deadline to file all the legislation, and there was thousands of bills filed every year. All of those bills are basic ideas, basic changes or additions to the law that each member thinks the legislature should consider. A bill can present an entirely new statute, an entirely new area of law, or it can propose changes to existing statutes as well. Those are amendatory laws. And throughout the process, every one of these bills is subject to amendment or changes at every instance, at multiple times throughout the process. What are committees? These are a huge part of the legislative process. In my opinion, they're the most deliberative part in the backbone of the legislative process, because these are the principal methods used to scrutinize, to debate, and to modify legislation. Committees are made up oftentimes of subject matter experts. Oftentimes they have witnesses and can have testimony and can have outside groups come in and talk about why bills are important and why these changes must occur. There's a couple of different types of committees that I think are important to note as well. Standing committees, special committees, and conference committees. A standing committee is a permanent committee, like the Appropriations and Budget Committee. That's a standing committee. It exists anytime that the legislature exists. Anytime the legislature is in session, this is a committee that exists. You can have a special committee that's formed for a very specific purpose, maybe to consider this one topic or this one bill, or maybe these types of bills. And then you also have conference committees. And these are the committees that are used when each chamber passes a different version of a bill. So if a House bill gets passed by the House and the Senate passes a different version and they can't agree on the changes on the floor, it goes to something we call a conference committee. So what is debate? Well, honestly, it's one of the most fundamental characteristics of a legislature, and not just of legislatures, but of any deliberative assembly. And it's used to ascertain the judgment of the body about the pending question, most oftentimes a bill or a resolution. Generally, two sides of debate alternate. So those for will debate, those against will debate, and will alternate back and forth to balance it out while people are giving their point of view. And they're only allowed when a motion is properly before the body. The legislature, the House and the Senate are not places, the State House and the State Senate are not places where members can just stand up and talk about anything that they want to talk about any bill they want to talk about. They can only talk about bills or resolutions that are currently pending, that they're about to debate or amend or vote on. So what is decorum? We hear this a lot, particularly in the legislative context, but in general parliamentary law as well. So decorum is the proper order, etiquette, and conduct of members. It creates an atmosphere that is appropriately formal. Decorum is hugely important because the legislature does hugely important work. We're doing the work of the people. For the nearly 4 million Oklahomans, we're doing the work on behalf of the entire state. So decorum is important because it encourages order, preparation, and participation. But it also places the focus on the issues and not the people. One thing that we often see is people debating people, not necessarily in the Oklahoma legislature, but around the country. We see people talking about other people or other lawmakers or other policymakers. And decorum is really, really important because it focuses that debate on the issue and not the person. Decorum is also encouraged because by requiring the use of appropriate language and parliamentary terminology, we keep things fair, we keep things consistent, and we keep things from getting personal. And this often includes creating and enforcing a dress code, and additionally restricting food and beverages on the floor. And obviously the Oklahoma House has that, the Oklahoma Senate has restrictions on those things as well to keep everything appropriately formal. You're going to hear, if you're around the legislative process a lot, you're going to hear about the issue of germaneness. And this comes up frequently. But what is it? What is germaneness? Well, germaneness is the relevance or appropriateness of amendments or motions to the item under discussion. There's no perfect test to determine if something is germane or not. But here's a couple of questions that can help determine whether an amendment or a motion is germane to the question that it's applied to. So if you've got a bill that you're currently considering and there's an amendment, you might ask is, how is this amendment related? And here's a couple of questions that can help with that. Does the amendment deal with a different topic or subject? Does the amendment unreasonably or unduly expand the subject of the bill? Would the amendment introduce an independent question? And would the amendment require a change in the bill title? Would it require further elaboration about what the bill does in the opening comments? Also, what is the journal? You'll hear a lot of comments about this during floor debate occasionally, but the journal is hugely important. It's the official record of the actions taken in the proceedings of a legislative body. And not only is it the official record, it's required by the state constitution. Anytime a bill is on third reading, a record of the ayes and the nays are required to be printed in the journal. This is where people can go see the final vote. Yes, everybody can go see it on our website, or read about it on social media or any place like that. But the official formal record is compiled in the journal, which we also publish on the website, but it's also filed with the Secretary of State's office. What is a motion? And this gets to the basics of parliamentary procedure and parliamentary law. A motion is very simple. It's a proposition or request that the body takes some action upon a matter. This is the basis for business in a legislative body, but in any organization, in any meeting that you've ever been a part of. The way that new business comes before a group, comes under consideration, is in the form of a motion. In the legislative context, that takes on a little bit more formal and advanced role because many of our motions are House bills or Senate bills or joint resolutions or simple or concurrent resolutions. They take on a much more formal tone because, like I said, we're acting on behalf of the state of Oklahoma. The things that we do need to be a little bit more formal and a little bit more complex because of how they impact people. What's the order of business? You'll hear this talked about frequently. The order of business it's very simple. It's just the sequence of business, the things on the agenda that need to be considered for each day that a legislative body meets. Each chamber decides its own order of business. So in the House, we've adopted a rule on the order of business, and we follow that every single day. What's a parliamentary inquiry? Well, a parliamentary inquiry is basic. It's a request from a legislator to the presiding officer, and this can be in committee or on the floor for information concerning the pending business, the body's rules and how they apply to the matter before the body, or to something that a member may want to do. So it's very basic. A member asking the presiding officer a question about procedure, parliamentary law, things that are going on in that moment or under bills that they're considering. What's a point of order? You hear this a lot. You used to hear it a lot in the State House. You hear this a lot in your private meetings as well. But a point of order is a parliamentary device used to require a deliberative body or a legislative chamber to observe its own rules and to follow established parliamentary procedure. So this is used if somebody believes that the body is violating its own rules, that they're not doing something correct, that something's out of order, that, for example, the amendment clock hasn't ended yet in the State House. The state legislature and the State House has a certain time period before the House can consider something if it's got an amendment. Well, what happens if we bring that up too early? Somebody can lodge a point of order. But there's a couple of really important things that people need to keep in mind about point of orders. One, it's got to be timely. You have to do it as the breach is occurring, as the breach of rules or conduct is occurring. If you do it after the breach or irregularity has passed, it no longer matters. You have to do it while the breach is occurring. And then once a point of order is raised, how's it handled? What happens next? Well, somebody stands up and says point of order, and they state what they think is wrong. And in the House of Representatives, you have to state the rule that you believe is also being broken, because that helps focus the presiding officer and members and staff on the relevant rule that you're talking about. So you have to cite the rule, and then the chair gives a ruling. The chair says, Representative so-and-so, your point's well taken, or your point's not well taken, and provides an explanation. And that's subject to an appeal. If the member believes the presiding officer is wrong, they can appeal that to the entire membership of the legislature, and a vote's taken. So one question is, what is a question? And it depends on the context. There's a couple of different things that a question could be. First, it could be exactly what it sounds like. It could be a simple query for information. I have a question about what we're doing here. But more formally, it could also refer to the proposition or the motion that is before the body for discussion. So you'll often hear, members, the question before the House is, shall the bill pass? Well, when we refer to the question, we're referring to that bill or measure under consideration. What is a quorum? I've briefly talked about this, but this is hugely important. This is one of those bedrock principles of parliamentary law. And a quorum is the necessary number of people whose presence is required to conduct business and to make actions legally valid. The Constitution requires a majority of the membership to be present to conduct business for a quorum to be there. If a quorum is not present, that doesn't mean the body cannot act, but there's only a couple of things the legislative body can do if it doesn't have a quorum. And it's adjourn, it's recess, or something that's called call of the House. And that's a mechanism where the remaining members, the present members, can compel the attendance of absent members. So if there's something important that they need to do, they can compel absent members to attend. What is a reading? I've mentioned that the Constitution requires a first, second, and third reading. It requires that third reading cycle. But this is basically the formal procedure that presents a measure before a chamber and indicates its stage in its consideration. Most state statutes, the Oklahoma Constitution requires 3 readings on 3 separate days in both chambers. So one question that you might think about is, what is the fastest time period a bill can become law in Oklahoma? If it requires 3 readings on 3 separate days in both legislative chambers, what's the fastest amount of time it can become law? Well, since I'm not with you, I can't actually hear your responses, but the answer is 5. And a lot of people say, CJ, that doesn't make any sense. 3 times 2 is 6. You got 3 days in the House, 3 days in the Senate. That's 6 days. And that's true. But the House can third read something on one day, and the same day the Senate can second read it, or vice versa. So 1 day of readings can overlap between the chambers. So the shortest amount of time that a bill can become law in Oklahoma is 5 days. What is a resolution? Well, similar to a bill, it goes through that same legislative process, but it often doesn't have the force of law. It's an expression of sentiment or intent or recognition of one or both chambers of the legislature. It can also be used to establish procedures governing the business of the legislature, and there are simple, joint, and concurrent resolutions. And as an example, the House rules are a simple resolution adopted by one chamber of the legislature. Joint rules adopted by both the House and the Senate are an example of a concurrent resolution because it's adopted by both chambers of the legislature. What's a veto? Well, the Constitution vests the governor with the power to veto legislation, and it's the formal mechanism that the governor can disapprove measures passed by the legislature. The measure that is usually sent to the Legislative Assembly by the governor stating the refusal to sign a bill into law and the reasons for the refusal. That's called a veto message. When the governor vetoes a bill, sends it back to the legislature. But when the governor sends it back to the legislature, it can be overridden by the legislature by either a 2/3 vote or a 3/4 vote in some cases. And what's a vote? We've talked a lot about this, but we haven't defined it. It's the formal expression of the will of the body, of an individual member, and at the end of the vote, of the will of the body. What happens if there's a tie? Well, if there's a tie, the negative side wins because it didn't receive a majority. There's a couple of different types of votes. You can do a voice vote, a division, which is a counted vote, but it's unrecorded, and a recorded vote. And a recorded vote goes in the journal. So I want to just briefly talk about the typical stages of legislative enactment, for enactment of laws. One, you have the idea. You take that idea, you research, you get with either the legal division or the research division, and you come up with proposals to fix a problem. They draft that, and then it's introduced in the first legislative chamber. So if you're a representative, it's introduced in the House. If you're a senator, it's introduced in the Senate. The first day is called first reading. It's where it's formally introduced. The second day, the next day, you'll do second reading, and it's formally referred to a committee, and that's determined by either the Speaker or the President pro temp of the Senate. They refer it to a committee, and then it goes through the committee process. Once it comes, if it comes out of committee, it goes back to the full chamber for consideration for general order and third reading. And this is typically when final passage is considered. If it passes that third reading, it goes to the opposite chamber. So if it's a House bill started in the House, it goes over to the Senate, and it repeats all those same steps. You got first reading on the first day, second reading on the second day, and then it goes through the committee process. And it could take weeks for it to get to its third reading step. If, as mentioned, the Senate can pass or the other chamber can pass a different version of the bill, it's got to go back to the other chamber to either adopt or send to conference to reconcile the differences. And if they're able to do that, pass the same bill or pass the same conference committee report out of both chambers, then it goes to the governor, and the governor can either sign it or veto it. And if the governor vetoes it, it can come back for override if that's necessary. So I want to, thank you for taking the time to attend this training and be part of and further develop your understanding of the legislative process. Again, I'm so sorry that I couldn't be with you live, but virtually. And I hope this pre-recording is a good substitute for me being there. And I just want to thank Joe and his team for giving me the opportunity to create this content, share this video. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me, cj.cavin, C-A-V-I-N, @okhouse.gov. And I'd be absolutely delighted to answer any questions that you may have about the Oklahoma House of Representatives or about the legislative process generally. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Now, when I used to instruct parliamentary procedure, I would tell people if you are an insomniac, that is the guaranteed way to help you fall asleep is reading Robert's Rules of Order. I know that was a deep dive into that. If you do have any questions about that, please place them in the chat or email CJ, email myself, and we can try and help you through that. Just like everything else, it takes practice with parliamentary procedure. And I've often called that process at the Capitol a chess game rather than checkers. Some lawmakers play checkers, others play chess. And the successful ones are the chess masters that know how to use the rules to get across what they want to accomplish. Before we move into the next part, I want to show, if I can pull it up. Let's see. I want to thank all our sponsors who were a part of this today. Legislative Learning Lab couldn't have been made possible without these sponsors. We already heard from the Journal Record. We also have the Cherokee Nation, the Sac and Fox Nation, the Southwest Ledger, Stanley Systems, the Law Office of Mike Green, the Honorable Corey Williams, my former seatmate, the former representative from Stillwater, George Crumey, Dr. Vamsi Kaliki and the Kaliki family, and Dr. Dwight Sublett. We appreciate each of them for being a part of this. And as we go into the final part, really looking forward to a deep dive discussion into an issue that's important with OICA and some of the areas where we've worked over the last several years, and to kind of give you an idea on one topic of the work that goes into getting an issue passed at the Capitol when we have several people working on that same topic. The next moderator, pleased to introduce Lynn Manaugh, who is the Potts Family Foundation's Director of Communications and Program Support. As a full-time employee, she handles the communications and social media responsibilities. Her current work includes coordinating screenings of the documentary film Resilience, the Biology of Stress and the Science of Hope. If you have not seen it, you need to watch it, because a lot of us have been working to make sure people understand ACEs. And she has worked across the state with that, making sure that that documentary is shown to as many people as possible. She serves as a community manager for Raising Resilient Oklahomans. The Oklahoma virtual website for ACEs is connection.com. She works in developing, coordinating the Self-Healing Communities Network and as ACE Interface Master Trainer Program for the state, and co-coordinates the Early Childhood Legislative Caucus, which we are a proud partner to help with that. So Linda, I'm going to turn it over to you to shepherd in our next panel, and then we'll wrap everything up for the day. So Linda, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you, Joe, and good morning, all. It's been interesting juggling back and forth between Oklahoma Policy Institute's work in Budget and Summit and this good work here with OICA and all of it gearing up to hopefully a productive legislative session. I've been asked to start off this session with a brief history of the work that led up to the formation of the Trauma-Informed Care Task Force and a little bit about the role of that the Potts Family Foundation has played in that effort. So much credit, though, has to go for the early impetus of this work and raising awareness to Carolyn McAllister. She's a tireless community volunteer and retired professor who initially brought the Resilience documentary to our attention at the foundation in the summer of 2017. She also started the first, or one of the first, multidisciplinary community coalitions in Oklahoma to address the impact of trauma on her community of Stillwater. While PFF started showing the Resilience documentary around the state, Carolyn began working with then Senator A.J. Griffin in the fall of 2017 on the legislation that became Senate Bill 1517, establishing the task force. Its purpose to study and make recommendations to the legislature on best practices with respect to children and youth who have experienced trauma. The bill was co-sponsored by Representative Carol Bush along with several others in the House of Representatives. Also in the fall of 2017, an interim study was held in the House of Representatives to learn about the impact of ACEs in our state. That study was basically replicated again in the Senate in the fall of 2018. Through the help and persistence of many groups and individuals, many of whom are on this call right now, Senate Bill 1517 was passed and signed into law by then Governor Mary Fallin on April 18th, 2018, with a start date of November 1st that same year. To learn more about the work of the task force, we're joined here by its two co-chairs, Annette Jacoby, Executive Director of the Oklahoma Commission on Children and Youth, and Dr. Jennifer Hayes Gruda, with lots of titles, but basically the Director of CIRCA, the Center for Integrative Research on Childhood Adversity, and a member of Potts Family Foundation Board of Directors. Annette, will you start off and talk about the structure of the task force and your work over the last 2 years, including agency, professional, and organizational representation, and the 2 work products that have been completed?
You got it. I am, let's see, host disabled, the participant screen sharing. So I have a PowerPoint. Miranda, are you around? Or I don't know who's controlling the screen. Anybody?
We have your PowerPoint. Are you wanting to run it? I also gave you the ability to stream.
Oh, it says it's been disabled. So either way, if you want to pull it up, that'd be great. And I'll just say next slide. How's that?
Sounds great.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So thank you everyone for having us. This is a subject matter that is near and dear to a lot of our hearts. And thank you for starting that. So I just want to start by saying that I love this African proverb of the greeting that the Maasai tribe would use from when they would walk from one village to another. And instead of saying hello or how are you doing, the question is, how are the children? And I think that's brilliant because we know that communities are healthy and thriving when our children are healthy and thriving, right? Children come in units with families and parents, and we know that when their parents are doing well, that the children have a better shot of living in nurturing and safe and stable environments. And that's what we want for all of our kids. So I really want us to start asking, how are the children? And in Oklahoma, the latest Kids Count information tells us that we rank 45th in the country for how are the children. And that's, it can be discouraging, or it can be the fire that gets in your belly and moves you forward. And so I'm choosing to let it be the fire in my belly. And we have plenty to do and places to go and improvements to be made. So let's talk about what this task force, how it was shaped and why it's so important in moving forward and changing those rankings. Do you want to go to the next slide? Thank you. So Linda gave a little synopsis of this already, so I won't belabor it, but I do want to say that I think it's important for everyone to recognize that it is not that the state of Oklahoma has not been working in the area of trauma, whether it's the prevention of trauma or the intervention of trauma, or perhaps the treatment of trauma. We have been doing that. So what I think this task force's charge that has to me been so incredibly valuable and important is to take what work we have, determine what is useful, and then coordinate those to the best of our ability, whether it's direct kind of efforts, whether it's campaigns, you name it. So that I think is the charge that is to me long lasting. Next slide. So it's important to know who's on this task force, but I want to say 17 people representing 17 different sectors is not the girth of what we want or need to tackle this issue. These are people that definitely have a heart for this and have expertise and have shared a good deal. And I'm going to move through these slides, but I just want to point out that there are valuable industries and partners that were not included. And it's just because you can't name everybody under the sun and still have a work group. But let me tell you that I think the data that the research coming out is pointing us ever more so to the direction of neglect, and that is oftentimes, but not always, tied to economics. And that if we really want to see a movement, not only in just the prevention of neglect and abuse, but trauma, we need to start talking about the economics facing our families and the challenges and decisions that they have to make on a daily basis. So who's not at the table? Our chamber or the business industry, the people who create good paying, livable wage types of jobs. We need to really talk about childcare, quality, affordable childcare. We need to talk about housing, safe, stable, affordable housing. So while we have a lot of wonderful people with knowledge about direct trauma, the work around it, I think that we're increasingly aware that this is a subject matter for everybody and anybody, regardless of what you do for a living or where you are in a stage of life. We all can play a role in this. So on this screen, you'll see the health department, the mental health department, along with substance abuse services, DHS, Department of Ed, a couple different facets of the Department of Ed. Our lovely Dr. Jennifer Hayes-Grudo, the American Academy of Pediatrics, myself. You want to go to the next slide? And then Indian Health Service, the Healthcare Authority, the AG's office, pediatricians being represented by Dr. Dunlap at OU, Steve Hahn from the Parent Child Center, Lana Beasley, who does beautiful research in this area, Dr. Saxton, and Janelle Breton of the Office of Juvenile Affairs. Is there one more? Okay, thank you. So I think that we have a wonderful group of people, but just keep in mind that if you are interested in this topic, if you would like to play a role, that we have numerous work groups and committees that are working on different aspects of this, and we are happy and willing to add you to those if you're interested in serving in that capacity. So special thanks, and I'm hoping and bet that we have some members here on this call that were authors to the original legislation. Hopefully Senator Griffin is on the call, and my guess is we might have some others, but I'm just want to say thank you for your vision and for the effort to get this across the finish line and to get this actually put into law. Next slide. Why do we need this group? Well, we're ranked number 45th in child well-being, and really when you talk about the direct correlation to adverse childhood experiences, Oklahoma is number 1 in the nation for children aged 17 or younger who experience 2 or more ACEs. And oh, Katie, you have a great question. I will, if you contact me, and I will put my email here in a minute in the chat, or maybe Joe could do that for me, or Jennifer. We'll get you in a group, so thank you. this is important because Oklahoma really is a group of traumatized people. And it's going to take a lot of work for us to think about how to lift us all up. Lift us all up. We have really got to view this as a collective and that we're all in this together. Next slide. Most of you are probably very familiar with this, but I just want to reiterate that stress, we all encounter stress from time to time. It can be a positive thing in our lives, while it may not feel like it at the moment. Studying for a test and accomplishing something around that test, taking the test and making a good grade, that's positive, right? It helps you grow. It stretches you. You experience something, you know how to handle it in the future. So that's something to consider. What we don't like to see, intolerable stress is something that can be mitigated. It's not anything you want. It's not anything you want to ask for, but with loving, caring, supportive people around you or other mitigating supports, you can get through it. What we don't want and what we see too often in this state and in this country is toxic stress, because we know toxic stress can actually change the architecture of kiddos' brains, meaning that when you have a kid sitting in a classroom and you want to say, oh, they're just, that's such a troubled kid, they can't focus, they're not listening. Well, it's probably because they've got some need to control their environment and continually look to see for safety, and their wiring is different because of what they've endured as a small person. So toxic stress, not a good thing. Next slide. I think this is a lovely visual, and I just want to throw it out here because I think that we often see this idea of the ACEs that we're familiar with and the ACE screening tool, but we would be remiss if we didn't talk about truly the grassroots issues that are so often connected to the 10 or so ACEs that we score. And that's poverty, discrimination, community disruption, the lack of any kind of economic or social mobility, poor housing, and violence. And so these are things that we really need to bring partners that work on those issues to the table. Next slide. This too, I think, is becoming more and more important, and the wonderful Dr. Bob Segi and Bart Klinka, some very, very prevention-oriented and focused researchers are now really beginning to talk about how do we move through these factors of being influenced by our families and moving forward into becoming a productive and healthy adults. So I think we're beginning to see more and more of these visuals that help us kind of connect what used to be in our brains, kind of very disparate areas of work. They're not. Neglect, abuse, adverse childhood experiences. We may see buzzwords that come and go, but this is all intertwined. Next slide. So I just think it's important. I kind of mentioned this early on. It is not as if this task force is creating new work. There's been so much good work across the state, led by state agencies, and these are examples that we have put in reports. Our first report was a scan of what activities were going on across the state. Particularly, we were looking for activities and group efforts that were not necessarily sponsored or organized or administered by state agency. So we saw some very creative and innovative work across the state, but unfortunately those outfits often don't have the finances or resources to go as broad or wide as we might like. So we really wanted to incorporate them into that first report, and that was due at the end of the first year. The second year, though, we've really focused on how to create a structure so we could move forward in a collective, organized, collaborative fashion. And what we saw is some of the state agencies were really doing some very big, heavy lifts and offering opportunities to people outside of their general agencies. And so when we talk about silos, and I know we can always do better when we talk about silos, you are seeing these agencies reach out and say, we're bringing in a national speaker, or we're having a training, or we're implementing a new model and offering it to other folks outside their agencies. And these are just some of the examples. Next slide. Oh, and this is just a continuation. And I want you to notice too that these examples cross the continuum. So some are prevention oriented, as we have here with the health department providing home-based services and parenting supports. But we also included on the previous slide all the work from the AG's office attending to victims who've already been traumatized by something and assuring that they get good services. So how do we make sure that all of these agencies are aware of what's going on? And that really is, to me, what this task force's main purpose will be as we move forward. Next slide. We had presentations over this past year in particular from some very, very interesting and innovative groups. We've heard from the Resilient and Self-Healing Communities that our moderator is associated with. We heard from OSU and their Center for Integrative Research and Childhood Adversity, Systems of Care Coalitions, Handle with Care, Embrace OKC, the list goes on. And if you will notice, I think that there is a word that is becoming more and more associated with all of these works. And I hope it is not a buzzword that becomes a flash in the pan, but I think the idea of hope in making it not something that's aspirational or even inspirational, but something that's actually science-based. And you see particularly DHS taking the lead in this with Dr. Chan Hellman. But the idea that hope is something that can be measured, that is needed. And we know if we are going to move any of this work forward, that the citizens that we are trying to assist or lift up and walk hand in hand with need to feel like there is light at the end of the tunnel and that it is something that is doable. And so what you will see from a lot of these models that we had or programs that we had or efforts can talk about is their connection to raising hope, or that there is a positivity focus and not just getting rid of something bad. It's also promoting something good, because we all know that just getting rid of bad does not necessarily mean that things are oh so much better. So it's making sure that you're doing both things, right? Getting rid of the negative and increasing the positive. Next slide. So this is the graphic that we landed on in this second year. And while it may be pretty and colorful, I just want to tell you that it took months for us to figure out a structure where we hope that everyone on this call can find a place where you could plug in. This was the idea of how all of these groups would connect. And we have struggled because without a coordinating body or resources, we had to kind of come up with, how does everyone fit together? So I think any of us who've been around long enough know that when times are good and the economics of government and nonprofit world are feeling pretty positive, people play very well together. And they're more likely to share resources, share ideas. But when times get tough and people are very, very worried about their own subsistence, right? Where do I fit into the landscape of things? Are we going to get our share of the pie? You know, all of this. Then what we see is people often retract and they're kind of in survival mode. And sometimes you hear people say, I just don't even want to be noticed. I want everyone just to not even recognize we're here anymore, so we can just get through this tough time, come out on the other end of the tunnel, and then kind of, you know, see the light of day again. Well, what we want to do and what we know we need to do is that when times are tough, that's when we really need to collaborate the most. And share our resources, but that's scary. It's threatening and it's scary if we're honest with ourselves. So what we tried to create here was a landing place for, let's say, a county group that comes together, made up of, you know, a wide variety of professionals, maybe concerned citizens and stakeholders. If they came and they said, hey, we want to work on XYZ part of trauma, we want to talk about more prevention services, Where would they go in this graphic? Well, we're hoping that the idea is in the center, they could find a body, and we have landed on the coordinating bodies most often associated with the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, but they've really been a leader in a lot of this work. And they've had consumer voice, a broad range of people at the table from both the public and private sector. Could it be broader? You bet. And I think that's something that will be talked about. But what we wanted to be able to do was, if a group wanted assistance or they had an idea, they could come to this to Seesaw, they could present, they could say, this is what we'd like to do. What are your suggestions? And at that, in this kind of a system, they would have access and supports from, you know, multiple state agencies, philanthropy, different groups, even including research and evaluation, and perhaps some kind of potential funding. I'm not saying there's a golden pot of, you know, somewhere at the end of the rainbow at the moment, but what we have tried to create is a place for people to go for support with maybe a local homegrown idea or something even broader if they want to bring in a national model and they'd like to plug it in. So we'd really like to see this move forward. We're thankful to Casey Family Programs for providing us a coordinator, and that a cross systems coordinator, and that person sits at Circa with Dr. Hayes Grudo. And she will be able to keep us moving and keep us coordinated. What we see time and time again is, with the best of intentions, task forces meet, they create documents, they have great ideas, and then there's no one to keep it moving because people go back to their places and get busy trying to just do life. So that would be a struggle. I'm seeing Casey Head's question, where might a fledgling, it disappeared, but fledgling foster care group go? So call me. I think we can figure out a place for you. And my guess is we might want to talk about, well, I need to know your issue first. Call me, Casey. We'll figure that out, or email me. So this is the graphic that we think will move us forward. Next slide. What are we really going to concentrate this year on, and what will we do as we move forward? These are the things we recognize we need more attention to. And when we look at other states who spent years and years in the making, we're starting year 3, so we feel like we can move this forward. Existing collaborations. How do we connect these? And you just saw the graphic. How do we really formalize those connections, whether it's through agreements or codifying into law? We're not really sure. There are lots of ways to kind of accomplish that. We'd like to do it with the, you know, easiest mechanism possible. So in case we have a better idea someday, we can change it and create that change pretty easily. But we do recognize that we need to have some kind of formal connection. We've also created a trauma-informed practice group, and that group has already been meeting and talking about the evidence-based practices that are going on and what do we think needs to either be brought in or enhanced. I will say, although we've spent a good portion of the past 20 years bringing in evidence-based programs, and kudos to the state of Oklahoma and the legislature for going that route. It's been so smart because we've been able to leverage that for federal dollars in a lot of instances. When times get tough, though, those programs have been cut. So what might have been a statewide service is probably no longer a statewide service. So we have a patchwork quilt across the state, and we really need to kind of figure out where those are existing still and where we need to beef things up. That's even changed since the year or so since we did the scan. So that's something that we just need to be vigilant about and always attuned to. Next, the cross systems coordinator, again, thanks to Casey Family Programs, that is in place. We also recognize that there needs to be some kind of easy to find resource as a website so that folks like you or other professionals or even those seeking services could easily find a compendium, all kinds of information, whether training opportunities or services. We also believe in expanding training opportunities, and that's something that I think we're already seeing a result of the task force that's already happening. And then last but not least, something I don't think, honestly, that we did enough, hardly any, and we need to do much, much more. Ethan Henderson, there is no website yet. We are in the process of trying to figure out where that should be, but thanks for that question. But lastly, I just want to say something that I think we need to do better in this next year and really make an effort, and that's connecting with community stakeholders, including consumers of services, and probably most importantly, the consumers of services. And so while we've done a lot of work with professionals at the table, we really need to hear from people what they think they need and what, particularly in their individual communities. And then next slide. Oh, I'm going to skip that. We'll go on to the next because I know I'm over my time. So if you need me, please feel free to reach out to me either by email or phone. I can help plug you into a work group or get you set into that graphic and figure out a place for you. We are very happy for anybody's involvement. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Linda.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Annette. That's great presentation. Jennifer, will you now share the key findings that have come out of the task force so far and what a trauma-informed focus on prevention might look like for our state?
Yes, and I have some slides. So if on Seesaw, they've been saying when they transfer the slides, they say, you now have the power, meaning you have the PowerPoint. But we have focused on identifying not just what's going on in the state, but we've also focused on what should we really be drilling down into and what are the big principles going forward, because opportunities change, situations change. Just as Annette mentioned, there are good times, there are bad times. We know we are a trauma-filled state. We also know that we're a resilient state. We are still here. We do manage to limp along and we recover, but are we doing it intentionally? Are we just sort of fumbling our way along? And often that's what it feels like to us. And so what we wanted to really focus on, how do we not just prevent ACEs, but how do we reduce their effects as we go forward? Being trauma-informed means being aware, being responsive, and then being healing. So let me just go through some of the points that I think I would love for everybody to take with them that we have talked about from the Trauma-Informed Task Force. So next slide, just to remind you, Annette put up the pair of ACEs slide. ACEs happen at individual levels and they happen at systems levels. They happen to children, they happen to many of us, and it has individual effects on our bodies, our brains, our behavior, but that also has an effect in communities. What we see occurring often are the cycles of ACEs. So as one family deals with ACEs, the effects of those ACEs on the child then turns into not only the next generation, but the effects in the community. So we've tried to kind of toggle between helping children and families and helping whole communities and systems be trauma responsive, trauma informed, and heal and provide healing. So next slide. I just want to keep that in mind. This becomes really important when we think about what buffers children from ACEs. We know that children in Oklahoma, children across the country, from our Head Start data, that the majority of children in Head Start have already had two types of ACEs by the time they're 3 or 4 years old. So assuming that ACEs have already happened, what do we do to help buffer those effects and become more resilient? Have hope, be able to see a better future. Well, our research at the Center for Integrative Research on Childhood Adversity, which is a National Institute of Health funded 5-year center. It's $11 million. It funds a lot of research. We're currently going up for our second 5-year period. We found that protective and compensatory experiences both help individuals become resilient and help them prevent passing those adversities onto their children. It changes the dynamic that they create in their families, in their relationships, and as parents. And it's important, I think, for us to reflect upon these ourselves, because many of us have ACEs, to look. The first time we gave the ACEs, Carolyn McAllister did this, to the Potts Family Foundation. I don't even know how many years ago this was now, 4 maybe. We give the ACEs questionnaire on one side and the PACEs questionnaire on the back side. So we have 10 ACEs and we have 10 PACEs. And someone at the board said, I'm so glad I took the PACEs, because if I just took the ACEs, I would think I was broken. But that's only part of your life story. It's only part of our communities. So I'm going to make that link in just a minute. So look at these PACEs, having unconditional love and giving it to someone else. These can work for children as well as adults to help recover from ACEs. Having a best friend, having that social connection, doing things for others without getting paid. That's a huge protective experience that we often neglect. As a child, to have a trusted adult outside of the home or outside of the family, and a teacher, a coach, a Sunday school teacher, having a mentor as an adult, and being connected with a social group. All of those things help children survive ACEs and recover from them, and help adults as they recover. And then the other 5, so we have relationships and we have resources, having opportunities to become good at something, whether it's the marching band or singing in a choir or art or chess, having a hobby as an adult. All of these things allow us to develop mastery and a positive identity and feel good about ourselves. Exercise is hugely important as a way to deal with that toxic stress that Annette talked about. It helps burn off stress. It helps heal the brain and rewire connections and reduce depression. If it's done alone, if it's done with others, it also fosters those social connections. The importance of being in an uncluttered, clean home with enough food to eat can't be overstated. Annette talked about how so many of our families are not able to recover from adversity because they don't have adequate resources. Going to a good school is hugely important, having those resources that provide for opportunities for learning as children and then later as adults. And then having regular routines. Having a bedtime routine when you're a child makes for better sleep. Instead of just falling asleep in front of the television or the screen because your parents are exhausted from working 2 or 3 jobs, but having those routines, you know, whether it's bedtime or dinner time, all of these things provide a sense of predictability and safety and are powerful predictors of resilience following ACEs. Now move to the next slide. I want to draw the parallel because if you looked at that list of PACEs, you see that many of them are under our direct control, but many of them rely on policies. Many of them rely on taxpayers making decisions that we are investing. Going back to the Masai greeting, how are the children? Well, they're not going to be very good if they don't have playgrounds, if they don't have schools, if their parents don't have opportunities to work and have adequate food for the children. So all of these resources and relationships require us to develop resilient communities. One of my favorite resilience researchers, Michael Unger in Canada, says, no one becomes resilient alone. It just can't be done. It's just not possible. So let's move to the next slide because I want to talk about what does it take for our communities to become resilient. Well, raising awareness is the first step. And I do want to take my hat off and a deep bow of gratitude and respect to Linda Manna and the Potts Family Foundation for doing a fabulous job. The last I heard, it was more than 10,000 people across Oklahoma have seen the resilience documentary. Is that may be a slight undercount now because it's a little harder to do it by Zoom, but they continue to do Zoom meetings and Zoom reactive panels after the meeting so people can discuss it. So I think we're making a really good start on raising the awareness and helping people realize what trauma does how widespread it is. And then the next stage, which is seeing how trauma affects us. I've started recognizing in my own organization, I know we all know that OSU is just virtually perfect. Those of you who bleed orange, you know this. But I actually have to confess, I was at OU for 5 years before I moved to OSU. So I love those folks too. And even in these nearly perfect organizations, when I see things that don't quite work, I'm starting to recognize this is a trauma reaction. This is a reaction to childhood events that taught us we can't trust other people, or that we are not willing to share some resources perhaps, or that we just need attention in ways that aren't always very appropriate. So recognizing how trauma affects individuals, our colleagues, and our systems is the next step in becoming trauma informed, and responding then differently. Instead of reacting ourselves, well, I'll show you, you want to start a little war, the trauma responsive response is to recognize, oh, this is a trauma response. So instead of pushing back, I need to help this person feel safe. I need to help this system see a different pathway where there's plenty, where there's opportunity, as opposed to hunkering down and fighting for my team or my resources. So that's responding by putting this knowledge about what trauma does into practice, and then preventing re-traumatization in our policies so that we don't do things that trigger these kinds of reactions. These are the original trauma-informed practices established by the U.S. Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration back in 2014. As this work continues, we are evolving, I think, better understandings of how systems can be more than trauma responsive and go beyond just preventing re-traumatization. So in the task force, we have tried to focus on what research and what programs are out there that help us move from being organized around trauma, which tends to be trauma-inducing in our systems, tends to be really highly dysfunctional, like a dysfunctional family, when we're reactive. And we, instead of telling a narrative that moves us forward, we just keep harping on what bad things happened to me, maybe not in my childhood, but last week with the supervisor, or distracting ourselves, or numbing ourselves, seeing people split apart, being okay with all the inequity that's around us, and relying on authoritarian leadership that just tells and dictates without listening and being responsive. That is what many of us have been in. We've all experienced either large systems or small systems that were trauma-inducing. If we live in trauma-filled environments, move to being trauma-informed, which I pretty much just described, and is a great first step. I mean, that is our hope, is that we all get to this step next, where we understand, we share language around what trauma does, we recognize institutional racism, discrimination, urban, rural. It's not just about race and ethnicity or other ways to divide people, where we take care of ourselves and each other, where we have ongoing training and input into our leadership. All of those things are good, but our ultimate goal is to become a healing state, a state where if you're born in Oklahoma, you think, how fortunate that my grandchildren are going to be raised in Oklahoma, where we really care about each other, where we're reflective, where we use this past full of adversity to inspire us to continued growth and development and being preventive oriented, where we collaborate and trust, where we are accountable for the difficulties others experience and try to create more opportunities and equity. And our leadership is based on relationships and not just power. So those are the main criteria that I think I tried to pull out of all the meetings that we have had, whether it's the task force or our working groups, and focus on what is this framework that we're trying to develop as we move beyond being trauma affected to trauma responsive to trauma recovered, and we create a state that's healing and organizations that help people heal. So that's kind of pie in the sky. That's my job as a leader of a research center, is to see that North Star, maybe way out there. But, you know, I think what I can tell you is this task force and the people in it and the people I've worked with through the Children's State Advisory Working Group and the State Advisory Task Force, they're committed. And we would love to have more voices, more hands and legs and brain power, because I think we've launched something here in Oklahoma that is going to continue. I see Carolyn McAllister is making comments. I can't talk and read at the same time, but
Jennifer,
I'm done. So questions,
Jennifer,
or moving on? Linda?
You do have a question that Carolyn asked, and let me see if I can find it now, about the age group. When you referenced the children in Head Start having 2 ACEs, she asked what was the age group of that statistic?
That was 0 to 3. And I can send you Carolyn likes the references, so I'll be happy to send you that data. That came from one of our colleagues in Arkansas who looked at that national data set, Lorraine McKelvey.
Great. Well, thank you so much for creating that vision of hope and a resilient Oklahoma for us. Our last panelist, I just need to say it took Representative Sherry Conley about 15 minutes after her swearing in as a new legislator in early 2019 to become engaged in this work. As a former educator and school administrator, she became passionate about getting the resilience documentary in front of every school in her district and the surrounding districts. She began also crafting legislation to ensure that educators and other school personnel and future teachers had sufficient training in trauma-informed care. Representative Conley, will you talk a little bit now about the several bills that you have now authored in this area and about your new role on the federal policy level?
Thank you, Linda. Can you all hear me? Okay. Thank you for inviting me to come talk to you guys today about this. And it is a great honor to work with so many amazing minds with just huge hearts for children and for Oklahomans. And it is a true honor to get to work with each and every one of you. Annette and Jennifer, wow. You guys have done amazing jobs. Those were incredible presentations, and thank you for those. And I look forward to this future work that we're going to do. I believe that Oklahoma truly is on a path to be a leader in this work. Between the task force that's just wrapped up and the caucus, the trauma-informed caucus that is just recently formed. I'm excited about that. And the legislation that we're getting through, and all of the people, the 13,000 Oklahomans who've seen the video, and I just pray that we can do more about that. I would love to get this into police departments and sheriff's departments and the jails, and even into our prison systems where our prison guards are seeing it. I would love to see more. I know that some of our pediatricians are using an assessment with families, and I would love to see that statewide, where they're all assessing families' needs, because prevention is ultimately our goal, right? So that's where my heart goes, is prevention. Because think of all of the money that would free up for us to do other great things in our state. If we were paying less to incarcerate individuals, we were paying less at prisons, we were paying less for drug and alcohol rehab, and all of the things that ACEs actually cause, our health outcomes. We could improve those, and so much money that we would have to do other great things in our state. So I applaud you all, and I love that that the groundwork has already been done. I'm looking forward to, and I appreciate how much of the groundwork has already been done and started when I came into this. But it's also so exciting to get to see the next step in the action portion of this. Because ultimately we can do research and we can talk about data and we can look at what the causes of ACEs are, but until we start doing something to change the trajectory, then it really is all for nothing. So I've got 2 bills this year that I believe will allow us to take another step. I'm adding on to the teacher pre-certification program, and I've got a bill. It is putting the multi-tiered systems of support into the pre-certification process. We've got the Oklahoma Association of Classroom Teacher Educators on board with this. They helped craft the language. The Oklahoma Association of School Psychologists also worked for this language, and it really came out of some work that I did last session and then the interim that I did earlier in the summer. What it is, if you're not familiar with it is a framework, and it's not just a theory. It is a true framework where we can do school in Oklahoma this way. There have been, I think, 3 or 4 other states that have tried it, but they didn't have the systems in place. They didn't have the preliminary work that we've already started in the state of Oklahoma to make it actually work for them. And so I am in contact with them, trying to talk to them about, what has worked for you, what has not worked for you, what do you wish you would have done, what have you learned from this, and what would you do differently type scenarios. And so if we can get our teachers trained on this, and then perhaps within the next 2 years, and with the task force coming through, I can see this actually passing maybe next year, if we can get our budgetary people on board and show them the benefits of what, tackling it from the education side of it. Because when children experience it in their homes, and then they grow up as adults, and then we all have to deal with them at that point. And so I don't know where I was going with that, but one of the things that I love hearing you all talk about is the PACEs, because so many times people talk about trauma, but they don't talk about the hope portion of this. And that's really what we need to drive home, is that, yes, this sounds dreadful when you talk about it, but there's hope and there's things that we can do. And that if we will just do them here in the state, then we can truly be leaders. And I think that's where I'm so excited about being appointed as co-chair to the national committee, and getting to not just take what we're doing in Oklahoma, but also going to the other states and learning what they're doing and what's worked for them and bringing it back to our state to implement here. I think that Oklahoma is in a unique position to be able to really make this work at the school level as well. All of those agencies, Jennifer, that you listed on there, the one that I didn't see was Oklahoma Association of Youth Services, those 39 agencies across the state. I mean, they are fully equipped, being public-private partnerships, having money from OJA, and then other monies that they can craft to the needs of what the community is and to what the schools have. No other state has that. No other state has those 39 agencies. And so we have to make sure that me as a legislator and the legislature in Oklahoma, that we protect those dollars that are going to OJA to fund those 39 agencies, because they're going in. And when you look at this MTSS program, I said all that to get to this, that when you look at the MTSS program, that it's a pyramid. So you look at the bottom portion of it, and of course, the pyramid is flipped when you go into school districts like Oklahoma City and Tulsa. Their 80% is on the top, but the bottom portion is 80% of the kids, where they get good curriculum, they have good classroom management, they have support at home, they have friends and support networks, and they're involved in sports, and they have all of those things to help them be successful. Then in the next tier, it's about 15% of the kids who need additional help. They might need a little bit of one-on-one. They might need a little bit more intensive help with their schoolwork. They might struggle academically and behaviorally. And then, of course, you have the top tier, which is about 5% of the kids who need that intensive training or intensive help. They might need resources outside of school through counseling services. And chances are, if that child needs that kind of support, the family probably needs it as well. And so we need to make sure that that top 5% on that pyramid in our school districts outside of our urban districts, that they have those services, they know where to get them, and that this MTSS program teaches the teachers how to say, if this, then that. It is loose enough to where school districts can choose the programs that they put in place. So it preserves some of that local control while giving them a framework to make sure that every child has, basically what you're doing is you're putting every child on an independent learning plan. That, they look at the child as a whole child, behavior, academics, and mental health. And they make sure that every child has what they need in order to be successful. So that's the MTSS bill. That is number 1773, I think. Let me look. Yes, 1773. And then the Office of Trauma Informed Care. I'm excited to run this bill and get this passed and make sure that I know it's very exciting. And of course, funding for that is going to be maybe a challenge. But if we've got that trauma-informed task force that is, or the caucus, where we are going in there and we're telling them we need this money, to make sure that this is done properly, so that it's not just something that's funded temporarily and then the funding goes away. Because this, again, I'm just going to say this. These two pieces of legislation could change the trajectory of our state forever if it is done right and if it's done, done consistently and with fidelity. So that one is 1774. Looking forward to pushing that through. And of course, I'm going to have to go through and with all my colleagues and make sure they're on board and stress to them the importance of funding this program, the 1774. So that's pretty much all I've got. Do you guys have any questions for me? Or
Sherry, there's one in the chat here. Carolyn McAllister has asked if you would consider working to change the education statute that allows corporal punishment in our public schools. There's overwhelming evidence-based scientific research that hitting harms children, not just physically, but more significantly mentally. The state should not allow districts to make the choice of using corporal punishment as discipline. Oklahoma law, even cognitively disabled children can be paddled with parent permission. If we were a trauma-informed state, we cannot have laws that allow adults in our schools, and I would add state employees, hit children. Schools should be no hit zones.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And we will definitely look at, if you'll send me what the statute is on that, I'll look at what we can do. That's one of the great things about this MTSS. It started out, my work actually started as a means to try to stop children from being suspended, that we meet the needs of the children, figure out what resources the child and the family needs, wrap those services around those children, keep them in school, because they're not doing anything if they're sitting at home. And parents are, a lot of times parents are not equipped to be able to help their children at home anyway, in some of these circumstances. So we need to be addressing the issues that are causing the behavior problems. And hopefully with that work that we do in the state towards this, that it will actually end the need for corporal punishment, altogether. So I agree with you that we do need to look at that. And so thank you for bringing that to my attention. That is something that I hadn't even thought about. So
well, she might have already emailed it to you, so
okay,
be looking for
perfect.
that.
Okay, perfect.
Here's a question from Claudia Swisher, and I have the same question. You referenced a trauma-informed caucus. Is that, we have the early childhood caucus. Is this something separate, different? Who, and if so, she's asking if you could share the names of legislators who are on it.
Yeah, it was proposed by Representative West, Josh, I believe, and I believe it's a bicameral caucus that has been started. I got an email. Well, I got an invitation and an email on it. It's just been within a couple of weeks that it was announced. So I'll have to go back and find that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's exciting. It's really exciting.
Yeah, good to know. And then there's another question. Does this or other legislation provide for increased counseling within the schools as a support for teachers?
So I have not addressed that issue. That is one, once again, it is on the State Department of Education's asks for their budget to increase the counselor corps within the schools. But I would say that unless and until we actually do that and then stop the schools from using counselors for things other than dealing with children, you're really throwing your money away when you pay for counselors and then they end up being test monitors or doing recess duty. I mean, it's good for them to be out with the kids and, around them and that sort of thing. But, if they're doing administrative duties and not actually counseling the kids, then we're throwing our money away as a state. So until we stop allowing schools to do that, which it's hard to do in those rural districts, because a lot of times they're so limited on their administration anyway. So I've heard both sides of that coin, but ultimately the counselors need to be counseling. So that's the reason why I have jumped on board and pushing those 39 agencies so hard, because those 39 agencies, they have counselors on staff. And so let me just give you an example. And most of you are probably very familiar with them, but I sit on the board of Frontline Family Solutions here in Newcastle. And I've been working really, really closely with them, talking to the superintendent here in Newcastle, talking to Mindy Bellick, who's the executive director, and trying to get those two together, because for so many years, the superintendent would not allow Frontline to come into the school or have anything to do with the school. So, and I don't know if it's a breakdown in communication. They don't understand what it's all about. They don't want people inside the school. I don't know. But anyway, that's one of the things that I've been trying to do, is make those connections and encourage superintendents to reach out to these agencies to get support. Because, for example, we had a young man out here in Newcastle back before Christmas that 18 years old, senior in high school, got kicked out of the career tech. His truancy went up. He had good grades, and was on his pathway to graduating in May, and then just all of a sudden started having troubles, and no one knew it. Of course, I will blame the pandemic for part of this, but no one knew that he was in trouble until someone found him sleeping in one of the couches in one of the common areas at the high school at 5:30 in the afternoon on a Friday, or on a Thursday, I guess. And so, then the counselor gets involved. And like I said, I had been, encouraging that relationship. And the day before that, Mindy had finally sat down with the superintendent, had a conversation with her and said, look, this is what I can do for you. This is how I can help the school. And the next morning, they called her on Monday morning. They called her and said, hey, I've got this kid. He's in trauma situation. He needs help. What can we do to keep him in school? Can you come talk to him? Well, immediately she sent over a counselor. They did an assessment with him. We got him a place to stay. He was sleeping in his car he'd been sleeping in his car for about 4 weeks. And so, you know, I rallied the community and said, hey, we need, you know, we need some clothing. We need his car fixed. We need to pay for hotel. We need some food, just until we can figure out how we're going to help him get stabilized. And the community rallied. The agency was able to help pay for some of the expenses. And, you know, we were able to get that young man in a temporary situation until he could fix what was going on at home that caused him to get kicked out of the house. And so those agencies are so important. That's at the high school level. They do all kinds of work at the elementary and the junior high level with their first time offender programs and young teen pregnancy and all sorts of things. So anyway, I'll stop my pitch on those 39 agencies, but that's just one of those resources that people just don't talk about, and a lot of people don't realize that they're out there.
Well, we're glad, and I know they're glad that you've continued to kind of raise that awareness, because there are so many people out there doing so many different groups doing such good work, but there is so much work to do. And, you know, we're not going to be okay until our kids are okay.
That's right.
We've got to start, as the Potts Family Foundation has said for a long time, invest in kids. The younger, the better. The research backs that up in terms of return on investment. So, Joe, I think we are right at noon, maybe 1 minute after. So, success.
Very successful. Thank you, Linda, for moderating this. Thank you to these three wonderful advocates for the work that they're doing. And thanks to all of our presenters today. I want to close on one point and just convey how important it is to do your homework. Like I said, this is a chess game. It's anticipating the moves and knowing what you need to do. But the work that Carolyn McAllister did to bring this forward was so important on what one advocate can do with a loud voice, knowing her legislator, Lee Denny, and then knowing where to go to do the right things, working with the Potts Family Foundation, who spearheaded the work with this. And Potts Family reached out to us to be the voices on that and the boots on the ground, and persistence. Linda's exactly right. But there's also some luck that goes into this. I will tell you, we would not have gotten this far if it hadn't been for Tonette Walker. And for those of you that don't know who Tonette Walker is, she's the First Lady of Wisconsin. And she hosted a first spouses conference for the National Governors Association that Wade Christensen attended. The first gentleman of Oklahoma, married to Governor Mary Fallin. Wade saw me at an event and pulled me aside and said, hey, you know about this stuff. What's going on with ACEs? And so I was glad to talk to Wade about it. And those of you who know the history, Wade would have every reason in the world to not want to talk to me since I ran against Mary, but he recognized how important this was. We sat down and had a 20-minute conversation, and then we met at a discreet place so nobody would see him meeting with me because he was still worried about that. And we had a wonderful conversation about ACEs. Task forces do not get approved in Oklahoma, but because the first gentleman of Oklahoma went to that conference and was interested in the issue and talked to Mary about it, and then Mary and I had a great relationship, even though we ran against each other, we talked about it. We were able to get that moving through the process. We had the executive branch covered. We found wonderful advocates in AJ Griffin and Carol Bush to run the bill, and they got it through the process. And now we have a wonderful advocate in Sherry Conley, who's now on the national level working with ACEs. And Sherry will tell you, Sherry's a conservative registered Republican. These are not political issues. Children like this, it's not a political issue. It's finding that common ground and the overused word of the week, unity on these issues. We can all work together, but we have to know the right language. And I am hoping we will see you back here tomorrow. I hope this first day of the Legislative Learning Lab has been a good event for you. I've loved it. The next 3 days that we have planned are going to be equally beneficial. If you have friends who have not signed up, encourage them to go to oica.org and sign up. And we will be putting these recordings on the internet. We plan on breaking them down individually. So high schools and other grades will be able to use these different breakout sessions as lesson plans, because I think the content of what we're promoting here, it's not covered in our government classes in high school, and these are the things that they need to learn. And that's what OICA is wanting to leave from this. Let's get these kids better educated in the process so they can be advocates as well. Thank you to each of you who have been a part of today. We will see you back here at 9 in the morning, and have a great day, and let's be strong advocates. Thank you all.